Ja. Bitte? Besser als in der Kirche. Ne? Exzellenz, liebe Schwestern und Brüder im Glauben, das ist nicht. Auch in diesem Jahr darf ich Sie zu unserem Symposium begrüßen, das von den beiden Schuelerkreisen von Joseph Ratzinger, Papst Benedikt XVI.
And I would like to welcome you to our symposium, which is organized and carried out by the two circles of students of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. I welcome you warmly and thank you for your participation here in the hall or at home on Radio Horeb or television EWTN, to whom I may already say a special thank you at this point for the once again competent transmission of the lectures. This is already this year in English and Spanish. This is already the fourth symposium organized in the conviction that the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, is a rich and precious treasure which helps to shed light on significant questions of our time and on important challenges also in our church, to be able to find viable and prospective answers.
Nachdem wir beim ersten Symposium die Bedeutung
After having considered the importance and mission of office ministry in the church in the first symposium, having devoted the second symposium to the fundamental question of God, and having then reflected on the beautiful message of the redemption of us humans in Jesus Christ in the third symposium, today's symposium focuses on the question of the relationship between binding truth of faith and further development of the Church's teaching.
Es handelt sich dabei
This is by no means an easy question,
aber leicht
but one that can
missverständliche
easily be misunderstood.
Wie kann die
For how
Wahrheit
can
des
the
Glaubens
truth of faith
verbindlich
be
und
binding
zugleich offen
and
für
at the
weitere
same time
Entwicklungen sein?
open to further
Ist das
development?
nicht ein Widerspruch
Is this
in
not a
sich selbst?
contradiction in terms?
Diese Frage
This question
stellt sich
arises
umso
all
mehr,
the
als in der
more
Kirche,
because in the Church,
zumindest in
at
unserem
least in
Breitengraden,
our latitudes,
oft das
the
Postulat
postulate
einer
of a further
Weiterentwicklung der
development of the
Lehre der
Church's
Kirche
teaching
erhoben wird
is often raised,
und der
but by
Weiterentwicklung
further
jedoch
development
Veränderung
is understood
verstanden wird.
change.
Von daher erhebt sich die besorgte
This raises the
Frage,
anxious question
wie die Wahrheit
of how the
unseres
truth of
Glaubens
our
von
faith
Gott her
can be
verbindlich
binding
sein
from
kann,
God if
wenn
it
sie
can at the
zugleich
same
von
time be
uns Menschen
changed by
verändert
us
werden
humans,
kann und was
and
folglich
what
in
is
richtiger Weise
therefore
unter
to be properly
Weiterentwicklung zu
understood
verstehen ist.
by further
Den
development.
entscheidenden Schlüssel zur Beantwortung dieser
The decisive
komplexen
key to
Frage
answering this complex
ist uns im
question
biblischen Zitat
is given
im
to us
Titel
in
des
the biblical
Symposiums
quotation
vorgegeben.
in the title of the
Ich habe vom
symposium.
Herrn empfangen,
Quote,
was
I
ich
have
euch
received
dann
from the Lord
überliefert
what
habe.
I have then handed down to
In
you.
dieser Aussage in seinem ersten
End
Brief
quote.
an die
With this
Korinther
statement in his
bekennt
first letter to the
Paulus,
Corinthians,
dass das
Paul
und nur das
confesses
den
that he
christlichen
can pass
Gemeinden
on to the Christian
weitergeben kann,
communities
was er selbst
that and
empfangen
only
hat.
that which he
So schreibt
himself
er im
has
11. Kapitel
received.
über die rechte Feier
Thus,
der
in the 11th
Eucharistie,
chapter on the proper
denn ich habe vom
celebration of
Herrn
the
empfangen,
Eucharist,
was
he
ich euch
writes,
dann überliefert
For
habe.
I have received from the
Jesus, der
Lord
Herr,
what
nahm
I
in der
then
Nacht, in
delivered to
der er
you.
ausgeliefert
Jesus the
wurde,
Lord
Brot,
took bread on
sprach
the
das
night in which he was
Dankgebet,
delivered
brach
up,
das Brot
and said
und
the prayer of
sagte, das ist
thanksgiving,
mein Leib
and
für
broke the
euch,
bread, and said,
tut
This
dies
is
zu
my
meinem
body for you.
Gedächtnis.
Do this in
Dieselbe
memory of me.
Traditionsformel finden wir nochmals im
after the meal,
15. Kapitel,
he took the cup
in
and
dem
said,
Paulus
"This
über
cup
die
is the new covenant in my blood.
Auferstehung
Do this as often as you
Denn
drink from
vor allem
it
habe
in
ich
memory
euch
of me."
überliefert, was auch
We
ich
find the same
empfangen
traditional
habe.
formula again in the 15th
Christus ist
chapter,
für unsere
where Paul
Sünden
speaks about the
gestorben,
resurrection.
gemäß der
For
Schrift,
first of
und
all,
ist
I passed
begraben
on to you what
worden.
I also
Er ist
received.
am dritten Tag
Christ died
auferweckt
for our
worden,
sins
gemäß der
according to the
Schrift, und erschien
scriptures,
dem
and was
Kephas, dann
buried.
den 12.
He was raised on the third day according to
Den
the
Gehalt der
scriptures,
beiden
and appeared to
Textabschnitte,
Cephas and then to the
die im
12.
ersten Korintherbrief eingeflochten
Paul became
sind,
acquainted with the
hat
content of
Paulus
the
in
two text
Jerusalem
passages
kennengelernt,
interwoven
und
in the
dürfte
first
bis in
epistle
die
to the
30er
Corinthians
Jahre,
in Jerusalem,
also kurz
and
nach
it
dem
probably
Tod
goes
Jesu
back to the
zurückreicht.
30s, that is shortly
Die
after the
beiden
death of
Texte
Jesus.
enthalten grundlegende
The two
Elemente der
texts contain
christlichen
fundamental
Überlieferung,
elements of
die sich
Christian
auf die
tradition
Auferstehung
that
Jesu und die
relate
Feier
to the
der
resurrection of
Eucharistie
Jesus
beziehen.
and the celebration
Denn
of the Eucharist.
beide Glaubensgeheimnisse gehören für Paulus
For Paul, both
unlösbar
mysteries of
zusammen.
faith belong indissolubly
Insofern die
together,
Auferstehung Jesu Christi
insofar
der
as the
verheißungsvolle
resurrection
Beginn
of
eines
Jesus Christ
Präsens ist,
is the
das nicht
promising
mehr
beginning
endet,
of a present
und
that
die
no
Eucharistie
longer
des
ends,
Präsens
and the
des
Eucharist is the
Auferstandenen,
presence
der
of
in
the
den
risen
Zeichen
one,
der
who
Hingabe
in the
immerfort
signs
sich
of the
selber
offering
gibt und so unser Leben
continually
ist.
gives himself
In
and
diesen
is
beiden
thus
Texten
our life.
dokumentiert Paulus,
With these two
dass das
texts,
Entscheidende
Paul
des
unmistakably
christlichen Glaubens
documents
nicht
that he did
selbst
not
erdacht
think
oder
out
erfunden,
or invent himself the
sondern dass es
decisive
empfangen
element of
hat.
the Christian faith,
Und damit
but
kommt
that
an
he
den Tag,
received it.
wie Paulus seine
This
Sendung
reveals
der
how Paul
Weitergabe
saw
des
his mission
Evangeliums
of
gesehen
transmission of
hat,
the gospel,
nämlich in den beiden
namely
Bewegungen
in the
des
two
Empfangens
movements
und des
of
Überlieferens.
receiving and
Mit den
passing
beiden
on.
Verben,
With these two
und zwar in
verbs
dieser
and in this
strikten
strict order,
Reihenfolge, ist das
the
Thema
theme
des
of
heutigen
today's symposium
Symposiums
is alluded
angetönt.
to.
Auf diesem Fundament der
On this
Vorgaben des
foundation of the
Apostels
guidelines of the
Paulus
Apostle Paul,
hat die Kirche
the
das
Church has
Verhältnis
always
von
shaped
verbindlicher
and
Wahrheit
also
des
deepened
Glaubens
the relationship
und weitere
between the
Entwicklung
binding
der
truth of
Lehre in
faith
ihrer
and the
Geschichte
further
stets
development of
gestaltet und
doctrine
auch
in his
vertieft.
history.
Das zeigt bereits
A glance
ein Blick auf
at the
jene
basic
Grundvorgänge,
processes with which the
mit denen
Church
die
was
Kirche
already
bereits in
constituted in
apostolischer Zeit
apostolic times
konstituiert
and which
ist
are part
und die zu
of its
ihren
enduring
bleibenden
characteristics
Wesensmerkmalen gehören.
show this.
Der erste Grundvorgang
The first
besteht in der
basic
Ausbildung
process
des Kanons
consists
der
in the
Heiligen
formation
Schrift,
of the canon of
die
sacred
gegen Ende
scripture,
des 2.
which came to a
Jahrhunderts zu einem
certain
gewissen,
but
aber
not
noch nicht
yet final
endgültigen Abschluss
conclusion
gekommen ist.
towards the end of the
Das
2nd
Entstehen
century.
des Kanons
The
ist dabei
emergence
das
of the
Werk der
canon was the work
apostolischen
of the
Kirche
Apostolic
gewesen,
Church,
die in einem
which in
intensiven
an
Ringen aus
intensive
der
struggle
Vielzahl von damals
selected
im
from the
Umlauf
multitude of
befindlichen
literary
literarischen
testimonies in
Zeugnissen
circulation at that time,
jene Schriften
those
ausgewählt
writings
hat, in denen sie
which
den
it
authentischen
found the
Ausdruck
authentic
und den
expression
Maßstab
and
ihres
measure
Glaubens
of its
gefunden
faith,
und denen
and
sie
to
die
which it
jüdische
assigned
Bibel
the
als
Jewish
Altes
Bible
Testament
as the Old
zugeordnet.
Testament.
Die Heilige Schrift in der
The sacred
Zweieinheit
scriptures in the dual
von Altem
unity
und Neuem
of the Old and
Testament
New
ist somit ein
Testament
Buch
are
der
thus a
Kirche,
book of the
das
Church,
aus der
which
kirchlichen
emerged
Überlieferung
from the
hervorgegangen
ecclesiastical
ist
tradition
und durch sie
and
weitergegeben
is
wird.
passed on through it.
Bei der Auswahl von jenen
In
Schriften,
the selection of
die
those
von der
writings,
apostolischen
which were
Kirche
finally
schließlich als heilige
recognized by
Schrift
the Apostolic
anerkannt worden
Church as
sind,
sacred scripture,
hat die Kirche einen
the Church
Maßstab
used a
verwendet,
benchmark
den
which
sie als
she
Regula
called
Fidei,
regula
als
fidei,
Glaubensregel
the rule of
bezeichnet
faith.
hat. Dabei handelt es sich um eine kurze
This is a
Summe der
brief sum
grundlegenden
of the
Inhalte des
fundamental
Glaubens der
contents
Kirche,
of the Church's
die in
faith,
den verschiedenen
which have been given a
Taufbekenntnissen eine
liturgical
von der
form
Liturgie her
in the
geformte
various
Gestalt
baptismal
erhalten
creeds,
und in den
and which have
konziliaren
found their
Definitionen ihre
continuation
Fortsetzung
in the
gefunden haben.
conciliar definitions.
Die grundlegenden
Fundamental
Glaubensbekenntnisse der
creeds of
Christenheit
Christianity
bilden den
are the
eigentlichen
real
Schlüssel,
key
um die Heilige Schrift
to
ihrem
interpreting
Geist
and
gemäß
passing
auszulegen
on
und
the sacred scriptures
weiterzugeben. Darin
according
besteht der
to their
zweite
spirit.
Grundvorgang
This
in
is
der
the second
apostolischen
basic
Kirche.
process in the Apostolic
Die Lesung
Church.
der Heiligen Schrift und das Rezitieren des
In the Apostolic Church, the reading of the
Glaubensbekenntnisses
sacred
sind in
scriptures
der
and the
apostolischen
recitation
Kirche
of
in
the
erster
creed
Linie
were first and
gottesdienstliche
foremost
Akte
acts of
der
worship
um ihren
by the
auferstandenen
congregation
Herrn
gathered
versammelten
around their
Gemeinde
risen
gewesen.
Lord.
Von daher gehen
Thus,
drittens auch die
thirdly,
Grundformen
the
des
basic forms
christlichen
of Christian
Gottesdienstes, vor allem der Feier der
especially the
Eucharistie,
celebration of the
auf
Eucharist,
die apostolische
go back
Kirche
to the
zurück
Apostolic
und gehören
Church
zu ihrer
and belong to its
Tradition,
tradition,
und zwar in der
in the
Überzeugung, dass das
conviction
Gesetz
that
des
the law
Betens
of
und
prayer and
Feierns
celebration
auch das Gesetz
is
des
also
Glaubens
the
ist.
law of faith.
Das Wort Gottes, das im Licht der Glaubensregel ausgelegt
Fourthly,
und im
the word
Gottesdienst
of
der
God,
Kirche verkündet
interpreted
wird,
in the light of the rule of
findet in der
faith and
apostolischen
proclaimed
Kirche
in the
viertens seine
worship of the
primäre
church,
Gestalt
finds its
in der
primary form in
persönlichen
the apostolic
Zeugenschaft des
church
Bischofs.
in the personal witness
Von
of the
daher hat
bishop.
sich in der frühen Kirche die
Hence, the
Überzeugung
conviction of
von der
apostolic
apostolischen
succession
Sukzession
in the
im
episcopate
Bischofsamt
developed in the
herausgebildet,
early
das
church,
im Dienst der treuen
which is in the
Weitergabe der
service of the
Offenbarung
faithful
Gottes und der
transmission of
apostolischen
God's revelation
Tradition steht.
and the apostolic tradition.
Mit dem katholischen
With the
Kirchenhistoriker
Catholic
Ernst
Church
Dassmann
historian Ernst Dassmann,
muss man die
one must
Herausbildung,
assess
theologische
the
Begründung
quote, formation,
institutionelle
theological
Stärkung des
justification, and
Bischofsamtes
institutional strengthening
als
of the
eines der
episcopal office
wichtigsten
as
Ergebnisse
one of
der
the most important
nachapostolischen
results of
Entwicklung
post-apostolic
einschätzen.
development. End quote.
Kanon der Heiligen Schrift,
The canon of sacred
Glaubensregel,
scripture, the
Grundform des
rule of faith,
eucharistischen
the basic
Gottesdienstes und
form of
apostolische
Eucharistic worship,
Sukzession im
and apostolic
Bischofsamt
succession in the
sind die
episcopate
vier
are the four basic
Grundgegebenheiten in der
realities in the
apostolischen
apostolic
Kirche,
church,
die man nicht
which
voneinander
cannot be
isolieren
isolated
darf,
one from
sondern
another,
unlösbar
but belong
zusammengehören.
together
In diesen
indissolubly.
Grundvorgängen
These
zeigt sich,
basic processes
wie das
show how the
Zusammenspiel von
interplay
Empfangen und
of
Überliefern
receiving
in
and transmitting,
harmonischer
handing
Weise
over,
geschieht.
takes place in a harmonious
Auszugehen
way.
ist dabei von der Bewegung
The
des
starting point
Empfangens,
is the
die
movement of
deshalb
receiving,
grundlegend
which is
ist,
fundamental
weil der Glaube der
because
Kirche
the
ein
faith
Geschenk
of the
Gottes
church
ist,
is a gift
der
of
sich in der
God,
Geschichte
who has
Israels und
revealed
im Geschichte
himself
Jesu Christi
definitely in the
endgültig
history of
offenbart.
Israel and in the destiny of
Die
Jesus
Offenbarung
Christ.
Gottes richtet sich
God's
in erster
revelation
Linie an die
is addressed
Kirche,
first and foremost
von
to the
der sie
church,
empfangen und
from which it
weitergegeben
is received and
Die
passed
Weitergabe der
on.
Offenbarung
The
in der
transmission of
Tradition ist
revelation
dabei ein
in tradition
komplexes, weil
is a
lebendiges
complex, living
Geschehen.
process.
Unter der Tradition ist nicht einfach
Tradition
eine
is not
gleichsam
simply a
mechanische
mechanical
Weitergabe des
transmission of the
erwerbten
inherited faith
Glaubensgutes
in the
im
sense
Sinne
of
einer
an
Archivierung des
archiving of what
Gewesenen
has
zu
been.
verstehen. Sie ist vielmehr,
Rather,
mit Joseph
it is
Ratzinger
to be
gesprochen, ein
seen,
dynamischer
to say with Joseph
Prozess,
Ratzinger, a
in dem das
dynamic
überkommene
process in which the
Glaubensgut
traditional
zugleich neu
faith is
ausgelegt
at the same time
und auf die
newly
jeweilige
interpreted
Situation
and
der
unfolded
Kirche hin
according
entfaltet
to the
wird.
respective situation of
Eine
the church.
legitime und notwendige
Unquote. A
Weiterentwicklung der
legitimate and necessary
Glaubenslehre
further
hat
development
von
of the
daher
doctrine of
einen
faith
wesentlichen Grund
therefore has an
darin,
essential
dass
reason
auf
in
der
that,
einen
on the
Seite
one
Gott
hand,
in Jesus
God has
Christus
revealed
alles
everything
offenbart
in
hat, was
Jesus
uns
Christ
sagen
that he
wollte,
wanted to say to us,
und dass die
and
Apostel
that
die
the
Offenbarung
apostles have fully
vollständig
testified
bezeugt
to the
haben.
revelation.
Dass aber auf der
But
anderen
that, on the
Seite
other hand,
damit noch
this
nicht
does not yet
garantiert ist,
guarantee
dass
that
die
the complete
vollständige
testimony
Bezeugung in
is
der
also
Kirche auch
fully
vollständig
received
empfangen
and
und
understood
verstanden
in
wird.
the church.
Die Unterscheidung
The
zwischen der
distinction
abgeschlossenen
between
Offenbarung
God's
Gottes und der
completed revelation
Unabschließbarkeit des
and
menschlichen
the
Empfangens und
incompleteness of human
Verstehens der
reception and
Offenbarung
understanding of revelation
führt die Kirche immer wieder vor
repeatedly
die
confronts the
Aufgabe, die
church
Lehre
with the
des
task of
Glaubens
handing down
ursprungsgetreu und
and
zeitgemäß
interpreting the
zugleich
teaching
zu
of the faith
tradieren und
in a way that is
auszulegen.
both true to its origins
bedeutet gerade
and in
nicht,
keeping with the times.
Dass der Glaube
This
in
does not
origineller
mean
Weise neu
reinventing the
erfunden
faith in an
und ein
original
neuer
way
Glaube
and
verkündet
proclaiming a
wird,
new faith,
sondern dass die
but
Auslegung
rather
des
that the
Glaubens an
interpretation
seiner
of the
wahren
faith
Origo,
is
der
oriented
Offenbarung
towards
Gottes,
its true
orientiert
origins, the
und so
revelation of
ausgelegt
God,
wird,
and is interpreted in
dass in
such a
den
way
jeweiligen
that it
geschichtlichen
can be
Situationen
understood
auch verstanden
and is
wird und
understood
verstanden
in
werden
the
kann.
respective historical
Die
situations.
besondere Verantwortung des
The
bischöflichen
special
und
responsibility
päpstlichen
of the episcopal and
Lehramtes
papal
besteht
magisterium
dabei in der
is to
Sorge um
care
die
for the faith's
Ursprungstreue
fidelity
des
to its
Glaubens.
origins. For
Denn
hierarchy
heißt
does
nicht
not
heilige
mean
Herrschaft.
holy rule,
Das
but
wäre
holy
ein
origin.
hölzernes Eisen.
That would be
sondern
iron
heilige
made of
Ursprung.
wood. Holy
Die
origin.
Hauptverantwortung
Its main
des Lehramtes
responsibility
liegt darin,
is
den heiligen Ursprung
to
des
protect
Christusereignisses
and
zu
transmit
schützen und
the
zu
sacred holy
tradieren,
origin of the
damit
Christ
auch in der
event
heutigen
so that it can
Situation
continue
seinen
its
befreienden Lauf
liberating
nehmen kann.
course in today's
Die
situation.
Hierarchie
The
hat sich als
hierarchy has to
Repräsentant,
prove
Garant
itself
und Hirte
as
der
representative,
Vorgegebenheiten und
guarantor and shepherd
Unverfügbarkeiten
of
des
the
Evangeliums
pre-givings
zu
and
bewähren und dafür
unavailabilities of
zu
the gospel,
sorgen,
and
dass
to
eine immer
ensure
wieder
that a
notwendige
constantly
Weiterentwicklung der
necessary further
Glaubenslehre
development
der
of the
Kirche
church's
so
doctrine
in die
of
jeweilige
faith
Zeit
takes place
hineingeschieht,
in the
dass sie
respective
zugleich
time in such a
ursprungstreu
way
und
that it is at the same
zeitgemäß
time
erfolgt.
true to the origin and in
Damit stehen wir
keeping with the
mitten in der
times.
Thematik des heutigen
This brings us to the topic
Symposiums,
of today's
als
symposium,
dessen
for which I would
Hauptreferenten
like
ich
to
Herrn Bischof
warmly
Dr.
welcome
Rudolf
Bishop
Voderholzer,
Dr. Rudolf
seit
Voderholzer,
2013 Bischof von
Bishop of
Regensburg,
Regensburg
herzlich
since
begrüßen.
2013, as the main speaker. Previously, from 2005 to 2013, Bishop Voderholzer was Professor of Dogmatics and Dogma History at the Faculty of Theology in Trier. He is also the director of the Institute of Pope Benedict XVI in Regensburg and a profound expert on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, as well as of Henry de Lubac, who is a kindred spirit to him. And he has done a lot of work on the subject of our symposium, as his recent book Offenbarung, Tradition und Schriftauslegung, Revelation, Tradition and the Interpretation of Scripture shows. Bishop Voderholzer will explain to us that in the light of the Second Vatican Council, the Apostolic Tradition knows progress under the assistance of the Holy Spirit. After the break, also this year 3 shorter statements will follow, which will shed more light on individual aspects of the basic topic. The second part and the subsequent discussion will be moderated by Mr. Martin Lohman, journalist and publicist and corresponding member of the New Students Circle. Thank you very much for your service, which you are rendering to us again this year. The question of the relationship between binding force and doctrinal development is also evident in the law of the Church, where this relationship is translated into canonical norms. In this sense, Pope John Paul II, at the promulgation of the new canon law in 1983, saw its task as, quote, translating the teaching of the Second Vatican Council into canonistic language, end quote. He, therefore, regarded the new code as the last document of the Council. To the discussion on the aforementioned balance between fidelity and change in the doctrinal and legal tradition, I am happy to be able to extend my welcome to Prelate Dr. Markus Graulich. As a Salesian priest, he has long been a professor for fundamental questions and history of canon law at the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome. Since 2014, Prelate Graulich has been working as Under-Secretary at the Dicastery for Legislative Texts at the Roman Curia. He also is a corresponding member of the New Students Circle and very attached to the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. The theme of the symposium finds a concrete culmination in the liturgy of the Church, since the living tradition of the Church is most clearly realized in the liturgical sacramental life of the Church. The Second Vatican Council emphasized that in every liturgical renewal, the healthy tradition should be preserved, and at the same time, the door should be opened for legitimate progress. And that consequently, new liturgical forms grow organically out of those already in existence. In view of this fundamental statement of organic growth, Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, has also always emphasized that there is certainly growth and progress in the history of the liturgy, but in no case are there breaks. For it is in the liturgy that we express most clearly what we believe in the communion of the Church yesterday and today and into the future. Dr. Uwe Michael Lang will address this topic. He is a priest of the Oratory of Philip Neri in London and an accomplished expert on the history and theology of the Church's liturgy, and also a corresponding member of the New Students Circle. A very warm welcome also to you. And also in this year, a more personal lecture on the roots of the theological thinking of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, shall not be missing. I would like, therefore, to welcome Prelate Dr. Helmut Moll. He knows the personality and theology of Joseph Ratzinger from his own experience as one of his doctoral students and collaborators at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith and as a member of the Circle of Students. Prelate Moll is also an honorary professor at the Gustav Siebert Akademie and responsible for editing the German Martyrology of the 20th century.
Ich hoffe, dass wir
I
mit
hope
diesen
that with
Beiträgen die
these
verschiedenen
contributions we
Dimensionen
can
der
illuminate
Thematik
the
mit
various
Sorgfalt
dimensions of the
beleuchten
topic
können.
with care.
Ich wünsche uns
I wish us
allen
all an
ein
enriching
bereichertes
symposium,
und
and
darf
I'm going
Ihnen
to give the
zunächst die
floor to
herzlichen
Bishop,
Grüße von Papst Benedikt
and I'm going to
überbringen.
convey the
Ich
most
konnte ihn am vergangenen Montag
vivid
wieder einmal
greetings of
besuchen,
Pope Benedict. I
ihn
was able to visit
informieren
him
über
last
dieses
Monday and
Symposium,
inform him about the
über das
symposium,
er sich sehr freut,
about which
wie
he's
über die beiden
very
Schuelerkreise,
happy, as well
und
as
er wünscht
regarding the
gutes
two
Gelingen.
student circles,
So
and he
darf ich
wishes
nun
us
das Wort
all
Herrn
success.
Bischof Rudolf Voderholzer
And so I
für
may now
seinen
give the floor to Bishop
Hauptvortrag
Rudolf
geben.
Voderholzer for his
Wir
keynote
freuen uns
speech.
über Ihr
We are
Dasein
pleased to have you here and are eager to hear your lecture.
Eminenzen, lieber Kardinal Koch, lieber
Eminences,
Kardinal
dear
Müller,
Cardinal Koch, dear Cardinal Müller,
liebe Mitglieder des
dear
der Schuelerkreise,
members
muss ich sagen, unseres
of
emeritierten
the
Papstes Benedikt
student circles
XVI.,
of our Emeritus Pope
liebe
Benedict
Schwestern
XVI,
und Brüder im Herrn, meine sehr
dear
verehrten
sisters
Damen
and
und
brothers in
Herren,
the Lord,
hier im
ladies
Saal
and
und an den
gentlemen,
Bildschirmen. Meinem
in this
Vortrag
room
zum Thema
and
der Möglichkeit
the
und Legitimität
TV.
von
My lecture on the
Dogmengeschichte,
topic of the
von
possibility
Entwicklung
and
und Fortschritt
legitimacy of
kirchlicher
dogma
Lehre
history,
müssen im
of the
Herbst des
development
Jahres
and progress of church
2022
doctrine,
zwei
must
Vorbemerkungen
in this
vorangestellt
autumn of the year
werden, die den
2022
besonderen
preceded by
Kontext
two
benennen, in den
preliminary
hinein meine
remarks which
Überlegungen
indicate the
gesprochen werden.
particular context in
Erstens,
which
die
my
bisherige
reflections will be
Dogmatik
spoken.
behandelte das
Firstly,
Thema
previous
Dogmengeschichte
dogmatics treated the
eher
topic of
vorsichtig
dogma history
apologetisch.
rather
Man denke
cautiously
nur an die Debatte im
apologetically.
Vorfeld
One
der
only has to think of the
Dogmatisierung
debate in the
der
run-up to
Assumptio
the
Mariae
dogmatization of the
1950,
Assumptio Maria in
nicht
1950.
unbeträchtliche Zahl von
A not inconsiderable
Universitätstheologen
number
war
of university
skeptisch bis
theologians
offen
were skeptical
ablehnend
to openly
aufgrund von
dismissive
vermeintlich
on the
nicht
grounds of
hinreichender
insufficient
historischer
historical
Bei
justification.
grundsätzlicher Bejahung
While
einer
affirming in
Möglichkeit des
principle the
Fortschritts
possibility
wurde
of
doch eher die
progress, they
Seltenheit
tended to
hervorgehoben
emphasize its
und auf die
rarity
strengen
and to refer
Kriterien
to the
verwiesen,
strict
die für die
criteria that
Feststellung
must
einer
be applied
Lehrentwicklung
in order
angewendet
to
werden
establish a
müssen.
doctrinal development.
Begegnete das Eintreten für
In the background was
Lehrentwicklung
not
bislang
least the
also eher
fundamental
dem Verdacht, sich von den biblischen
skepticism.
Grundlagen
Whereas the advocacy of
wegzubewegen,
doctrinal development has
trifft man
so
heute
far
nicht selten
tended
auf
to
die
meet with
umgekehrte
suspicion
Sicht,
of moving away from
dass
the
nur die
biblical
beherzte
foundation.
Weiterentwicklung dem Ursprung
Today one
wahrhaft
often encounters the
treu sei.
opposite view,
Nicht die
that only
geschichtlich
courageous
wahrnehmbare
further
Entwicklung müsse
development is truly
festgestellt und als
faithful to the
legitim
origin.
begründet und
It is not
erschlossen
the
werden,
historically perceptible
sondern neues
development that has
Fort-
to
und
be established and
Weiterentwicklung werden
justified and
vehement
developed as
gefordert. Ich nehme
legitimate,
damit
but
Bezug
something new, further
auf die
development
Debatten
and
im
evolution are
Umfeld des
vehemently
sogenannten
demanded.
synodalen Weges
I'm
in
referring here
Deutschland,
to the debates
wo von
surrounding the
etlichen
so-called
Mitgliedern der
synodal way in
Vollversammlung
Germany,
sogar
where a majority of members of the
Forderungen erhoben werden,
General
nach
Assembly are even calling for
Weiterentwicklung der
further
kirchlichen
development
Lehre
of
in
church
verschiedensten
teaching
Bereichen,
in a wide
nicht nur der
variety of areas,
Sexualmoral
not
und
only
der ihr
sexual
zugrunde
morality and
liegenden
the anthropology on which it
sondern
is
auch in der
based, but also in the
Sakramentenlehre in
doctrine of
Bezug
the
auf das
sacraments in
Bischofsamt,
relation
auf
to
die
the office of bishop,
Zulassungsbedingungen zum
to the
Weihamt
conditions
in
for
all
admission to
seinen
the
drei
ordained
Stufen
ministry in
und
all
nicht zuletzt auch in der
three
Ekklesiologie,
degrees,
Stichwort
and not least
synodale
also
Kirche.
in ecclesiology, keyword
Dies gibt
synodal
dem Thema
church.
heute
This gives the
seine
topic
besondere
its special
Aktualität und
topicality
Brisanz.
and
Und eine
explosiveness
zweite
today.
Vorbemerkung ist nötig.
And a second
Vorgängig
preliminary
zu den
remark is necessary.
Einzelfragen
Before
gilt es
dealing with the
wahrzunehmen,
individual questions,
dass sich
it is
gegenwärtig
important
in
to
der
realize
Theologie zwei
that two
grundsätzliche
fundamental
Richtungen
directions are
zeigen,
currently
die
emergent in theology,
Karl-Heinz Menke
which
mit
Karl-Heinz
Libertarismus
Menke
auf der
calls
einen
libertarianism
und
on the one hand
Kompatibilismus auf der
and
anderen Seite
compatibilism
benennt. Ein
on the other
libertarisches
hand. A
Freiheitsverständnis
libertarian understanding of
lässt
freedom
auch in der
only
theologischen
accepts,
Debatte
also in the theological
nur
debate,
gelten, was das
what the
autonome
autonomous
Subjekt
subject
konstituiert
constitutes
und
and
einsieht.
understands.
Jede Bindung
Any
an
binding
Offenbarung,
to revelation,
Tradition
tradition, or
oder
dogma
wird
is
als
rejected
Widerspruch
as
zur
contradictory
freiheitlichen
to the
Würde
free
des
dignity
Menschen
of the
abgelehnt.
human
Ohne
being.
weitere
Without
Begründung
further
werden
justification,
die
the
traditionellen, auch die
traditional,
biblischen
even the biblical
Fundierungen
foundations
als
are set
theologisch
aside as
substanzlos
theologically
beiseite getan.
insubstantial.
Für die theologische
For
Erkenntnislehre
theological
bedeutet dies eine
epistemology, this means a revolutionary
Umstrukturierung.
restructuring.
An die
The
Stelle
most
der wichtigsten
important
theologischen
theological reference
Bezugsgrößen, die
points,
sogenannten
the so-called Loci Theologici,
treten die
are
Zeichen der
replaced
Zeit
by
und
the
die
quote,
sogenannte
signs of the
Lebenswirklichkeit.
times quote, and the
Sogar die
so-called
Rede von
quote,
Wahrheit
reality of
wird
life.
vor diesem
Unquote.
Hintergrund
Even speaking of
sinnlos.
truth becomes
Es gibt nur noch
meaningless
mehr oder
against
weniger
this
subjektiv
background. There are only more or less
einleuchtende Gründe.
subjectively plausible
Dieses
reasons.
libertarische Freiheits-
This
und
libertarian
Wahrheitsverständnis
understanding
hat
of
zumindest
freedom
in
and truth
Deutschland bereits
has already
etliche
conquered
Lehrstühle
quite a
an
few
angesehenen
chairs at
theologischen
prestigious theological
Fakultäten erobert.
faculties, at least in
Eine
Germany.
Reihe von Ordinarien
A number of
beginnt,
ordinary
die
professors
sich
are
an den
beginning
Loci
to replace
Theologici als
theology, which is
Bezeugungsinstanzen
oriented towards
Theologie
the Loci
durch eine
Theology, as
Offenbarungsfreiheit
instances of
Philosophie
testimony,
autonomer
which,
Selbstbestimmung
with a
zu
revelation-free
für die ein
philosophy
Schriftler
in
zu
autonomous
allenfalls
self-determination,
garnierende
for which a
Zutat
reference to Scripture is at best a
Dem
garnishing
steht
ingredient.
gegenüber Der von Menke
This
so
is
bezeichnete
contrasted with what Menke calls
Kompatibilismus, der setzt ein
compatibilism. It
Freiheitsverständnis
presupposes an
voraus, das mit
understanding of
der
freedom that
Bindung
is not
an eine
only
vorgegebene
compatible,
Wirklichkeit
consistent
und
with a
Wahrheit
bond
nicht nur
to a given
vereinbar,
reality and
kompatibel
truth,
ist, sondern
but
geht davon aus,
assumes
dass der
that
Mensch
man
in
is
dem
free
Maße
to the
frei ist,
extent
in
that he
dem der sich
corresponds to the
zeigenden
revealed
Wahrheit der
truth
Wirklichkeit
of
und letztlich
reality
der
and
geoffenbarten Wahrheit
ultimately
Gottes
to the revealed
entspricht.
truth of God.
Gerade auf der Ebene einer Theologie
Precisely
der
on the level of the
Sakramente,
theology of the
die in der
sacraments,
vielfach
which are founded
kontingenten
in the
geschichtlichen
often
Vermittlung der
contingent
Heilsgegenwart
historical
Gottes gründen,
mediation of
verunmöglicht
God's
ein
salvific
libertarisches
presence,
Freiheits-
a
und
libertarian understanding
Wirklichkeitsverständnis
of
von
freedom
vornherein
and reality
jede
makes any
Verständigung
understanding of the
über
traditional practice
die
and teaching of the
traditionelle
Church
Praxis und
impossible
Lehre der
from
Kirche.
the outset.
Die folgenden
The following
Überlegungen basieren
considerations are
deswegen auf
based on
den
the prerequisites
Voraussetzungen
of
eines
a compatibilist
kompatibilistischen
understanding
Freiheits-
of
und
freedom and
Wahrheitsverständnisses.
truth.
Denn nur auf
For only
seiner
on this
Basis ist die
basis is the
aufgeworfene
question posed
Fragestellung überhaupt
meaningful at
sinnvoll,
all,
aber
but
dann
then
eben auch
also
notwendig.
necessary.
Aus der Sicht
From the
eines
perspective of a
libertarischen
libertarian
Freiheits- und
understanding of freedom and
Wahrheitsverständnisses
truth,
ist der
the
Aufweis einer
demonstration of a
kontinuierlichen
continuous
Lehrentwicklung
doctrinal
unnötig
development
und
is
sinnlos, denn
unnecessary
jede
and pointless,
Bezugnahme
for every
auf eine
reference to an
autoritativ vorgegebene
authoritatively
ob
given
nun
doctrine,
geschichtlich
whether
vermittelt
historically
oder anders
mediated
begründet,
or otherwise
wird als
justified,
Fremdbestimmung
is perceived as
aufgefasst
an
und keine
external
Verbindlichkeit
determination
letztlich
that
beantworten
cannot
kann.
claim any
Ich
binding
muss wohl
force
nicht
for itself.
betonen, dass ich das
I do not need to
libertarische
emphasize
Freiheits- und
that I consider the libertarian
als im
understanding of
Ansatz
freedom
nicht
and
mit dem
truth
christlichen
to be
Glauben
fundamentally
vereinbar halte.
incompatible
Aber wo
with the
diese
Christian faith.
grundsätzliche Unterscheidung nicht
But where this
wahrgenommen
fundamental
und
distinction
ihre
is not
Folgen nicht
perceived and
bedacht
its
werden,
consequences are
scheitert
not
jede
considered,
theologische Debatte
every
schon
theological
deshalb,
debate
weil
fails
nicht
already
klar ist,
because
welche
it is not
Argumente
clear
überhaupt
which
Gültigkeit
arguments can
für sich
claim
beanspruchen
validity
können.
at all.
In diesem Vortrag wird jedenfalls
In any
weiterhin
case, in this
vorausgesetzt,
lecture
dass sich
continues
in
to
der göttlichen
presuppose
Offenbarung dem
that
Menschen
divine
eine
revelation
Wahrheit
reveals a
zeigt,
truth to
der zu
man that
entsprechen
makes
ihn
him
frei
free
macht
and
und über
lifts
sich
him
selbst
above
hinausgeht.
himself.
Beim christlichen Glauben geht
Christian
es nicht
faith
darum,
is
dass
not
eine
about a
philosophisch-subjektive
philosophically
Weltdeutung
subjective
sich
interpretation of the
nachträglich in
world
historischen
being
Stoffen
subsequently
veranschaulicht. Im
illustrated in
Gegenteil,
historical
die
material.
Selbstmitteilung
On the
Gottes
contrary,
ereignet sich im
God's
raumzeitlich
self-communication
definierten
takes
Geschehen,
place
das
in
heißt in
spatio-temporally
der Geschichte.
defined events,
Sie wird
that is, in
freilich erst
history.
endgültig zur
Of course, it
Offenbarung,
only
indem sie
becomes
durch ein
revelation
empfangendes
when it is
Subjekt,
accepted in faith
apostolischen
by a
Kirche,
receiving subject, the
im
Apostolic
Glauben
Church,
angenommen und
and is
in der Kraft des
interpreted
Heiligen
and
Geistes
witnessed
zutreffend
accurately in the
interpretiert und
power of the
bezeugt
Holy
wird.
Spirit.
Das Depositum
The
Fidei ist
depositum
in erster
fidei
Linie
is
den
entrusted
Bischöfen
first and
als
foremost to
Nachfolgern
the
der
bishops
Apostel
as
zur
successors of the
Reinerhaltung,
apostles
vertieften
for purification,
Aneignung und
deeper
aktualisierenden
appropriation
Bezeugung
and
anvertraut.
actualizing
Ende
testimony.
der zweiten Vorbemerkung.
End of the second preliminary
Zum
remark.
Glaubensbestand der Kirche heute gehören Aussagen, die
The
expressis
Church's body of
verbis
faith
so nicht
today
schon
includes
immer und
statements
überall
which expresses
zum
verbis have
Glaubensgut
not
gehörten
always
und
and
vor
ever
allem
been
auch so
part
nicht
of the
in
body
der
of
ersten
faith,
Urkunde des
and above
Glaubens in
all
den
are not
Schriften der
contained
Bibel
in this way
des Alten
in the
und Neuen
first document of
Testamentes
faith,
enthalten sind.
in the writings of the
Prinzipiell wird
Bible
dies
of the
von
Old and New
allen christlichen
Testaments.
Konfessionen
In principle,
anerkannt,
this is
auch Martin Luther
recognized
und
by
die
all
evangelischen
Christian
lutherischen
confessions.
Gemeinschaften
Martin Luther
erkennen
and the
die Entscheidungen der
evangelical
ökumenischen
Lutheran
Konzilien
communities also
der
recognize the
ersten 5
decisions of the
Jahrhunderte
ecumenical
an
councils of the first
und
5
zählen ihre
centuries
Beschlüsse
and
zu ihren
count their decisions
grundlegenden und
among their
verbindlichen
fundamental and binding
Bekenntnisschriften.
confessional
Der
writings.
Terminus homoousios,
The term
um ein
homoousios,
Beispiel zu
to
nennen,
cite one example,
vom Konzil von
used
Nicäa
by the Council of
325
Nicaea
zur
in
Abwehr des
325
Arianismus
to defend against
herangezogen und
Arianism
ins Credo
and included in the
aufgenommen
creed,
ist,
although a
wenngleich
proper
sachgemäße
safeguard
Absicherung
of
des
biblical
biblischen
faith
Glaubens nicht
is not
selbst
itself
biblischer,
of
sondern
biblical but
philosophischer
philosophical
Herkunft
origin,
und somit
and thus
ein
more
Mehr
than scripture.
gegenüber der Schrift. Dies gilt
This
insgesamt
applies
von
in
den
general to the
Ergebnissen des
results of the
theologischen
theological
Ringens des
struggle
4.
of
und
the
5.
4th and 5th
Jahrhunderts und von den
century,
Präzisierungen
and
der
to the
Christologie,
clarifications in
Pneumatologie und
Christology,
Trinitätslehre,
pneumatology, and the
die sie dann
doctrine
von
of the
den
Trinity,
Konzilien als
as they were
Glauben der
then
Kirche
received by the
rezipiert wurden.
councils as the faith of the
Die
Church.
weiteren Beispiele, über die im
The other
Zusammenhang
examples
mit den
beyond
frühen
those already
Konzilien
mentioned in
schon
connection with the
genannten
early
hinaus,
councils, they
benennen
name
dann vor
above
allem
all
die
the
Inhalte des
contents of the
spezifisch
specifically
katholischen
Catholic understanding of
Glaubensverständnisses.
faith.
In der theologischen Handbuch
In the
Literatur
theological
wird für
handbook
gewöhnlich auf die
literature, reference is
Kanonisierung der
usually
Heiligen
made to the
Schriften,
canonization
die
of the sacred
Siebenzahl der
scriptures,
Sakramente,
the
die
number of sacraments set as 7,
Transubstantiation,
the
die
transubstantiation,
Wesensverwandlung
that
der
is the
eucharistischen Gestalten,
transformation of
die
the essence of the Eucharistic
Erbsündenlehre
species,
etc., vor
the
allem aber
doctrine
dann
of original
auf die
sin,
beiden
etc., but
Mariendogmen
above
von
all to the two Marian
1854
dogmas,
und
1854,
1950
Immaculate Conception,
Für all diese
1950 Santa
Glaubensinhalte
Maria.
gilt, dass
It
sie
is
nicht
true for all these
wortwörtlich
contents defense of faith that they are not literally formulated in sacred scripture and have only proven to belong to revelation in the course of the life and faith history of the Church.
so
and have thus been
festgestellt, feierlich
established,
verkündet
solemnly
und als zu
proclaimed,
glauben
and presented
vorgelegt wurden.
as to be believed by the magisterium.
Neuerdings wird zur Begründung einer schier
Recently, numerous
grenzenlosen
examples of
Entwicklungsmöglichkeit
supposedly
auf
even
zahlreiche
saltatory
Beispiele
doctrinal developments
vermeintlich sogar
in the last
sprunghafter
centuries have
Lehrentwicklung in
been
den letzten
pointed out
Jahrhunderten
to
verwiesen,
justify
die
an
ein
almost
Insistieren auf
limitless
Kontinuität nur als
possibility for
ideologische
development,
Fortschrittsverweigerung
claiming
mit
to
dem Ziel
expose
der
that an insistence on
Machterhaltung entlarven
continuity
soll,
was
wie
an
wir
ideological
später
refusal of
darauf
progress
zurückkommen.
with the aim
Vorerst
of
kann man
maintaining power.
festhalten,
I'll return to this
der
later.
Glaube auf
For
der
the time
Basis der
being, one can
altkirchlichen
state
Symbola und wie er in der
faith on the
katholischen
basis of
Kirche
the early
bekannt
church
wird,
symbola,
setzt die
and
Tatsache eines
as it is known in
Fortschritts,
the
eines
Catholic Church,
Wachstums,
presupposes the fact of a
Entwicklung
progress,
voraus.
a growth, a development.
Die Möglichkeit und Notwendigkeit
The possibility
der
and necessity
Tradition
of tradition
liegt in der
lies in the
Nicht-Identität von
non-identity of
Offenbarung
revelation
und
and
Heiliger
sacred
Schrift
scripture.
begründet. Offenbarung
Revelation
liegt der Schrift
precedes
als
Scripture
geschichtliches
as a
Ereignis
historical
voraus
event
und wird
and is
zunächst in
first
mündlicher
witnessed
Überlieferung
to in
bezeugt,
oral
bis sie sich im
tradition
Raum der
until it finds
Glaubensgemeinschaft
expression in the
Israels
space of
und
the faith community of
neutestamentlich
Israel and in the
im
New
Raum der
Testament
Kirche, in den
in
Heiligen
the space of the
Schriften
Church
definitiv
in the sacred
niederschlägt.
scriptures.
Christus ist, so
Christ
sagt es die
is, as the Constitution on
Offenbarungskonstitution des
Revelation
Zweiten
of the Second
Vatikanischen
Vatican
Konzils,
Council,
Dei Verbum im
Dei
zweiten
Verbum
Artikel,
says in its second
Mittler
article, the
und Fülle
mediator
der
and
ganzen
fullness
Offenbarung.
of all revelation.
Tradition und Schrift
Tradition and
sind
scripture
demgegenüber
are not
nicht
themselves
selbst Quellen der
sources of
Offenbarung,
revelation,
sondern Medien
but
ihrer
medium
Weitergabe
of
im
its
Glauben der
transmission
Kirche.
in the faith of the Church.
Die Bedeutung der Kirche als
The
Subjekt
significance of
der
the Church as the subject of
Offenbarungsannahme
the
und
acceptance
Weitergabe
and transmission of
und in diesem
revelation,
Sinne
and
als
in this
Trägerin
sense,
der
as the
Tradition
bearer of
herausgearbeitet
tradition,
zu haben,
is
gehört zu den
one of the
originellsten
most
und zugleich wichtigsten
original and at the
theologischen
same time
Einsichten des
most
jungen
important
Professors Joseph
theological
Ratzinger.
insights of the young
Damit hat
professor
vermittelt
Joseph
durch
Ratzinger.
Kardinal Frings,
In this
der
way, he,
Offenbarungskonstitution
helped by
Dei
Cardinal
Verbum
Frings,
maßgeblich und vor
significantly
allem
and above all
grundsätzlich
fundamentally
vorgearbeitet.
prepared the Constitution on the
Ein erster
revelation
und
Dei Verbum.
fundamentaler Schritt der
A
Lehrentwicklung
first and fundamental
ist die
step in the development of
christologische
doctrine
Relektür
is
der
the
Schriften
Christological
Israels
reflection,
und ihre
relecture of the
Verwandlung und
scriptures
Erhebung
of
in ein
Israel and their
Zeugnis für
transformation
Christus.
and elevation into a
Die
testament for Christ.
Spannungseinheit von
The
altem und
unity
Neuen
of tension
Testament gründet
between
letztlich
the
in der
Old and New
Einsicht in die
Testament
Einheit
is
der
ultimately
Heils- und
based on the insight
Offenbarungsgeschichte, die im
into the unity of
Christusereignis
salvific history,
kulminiert.
which culminates in the
Aufs
Christ
engste
event.
damit verflochten und
Closely
untrennbar damit
interwoven with
verbunden
this
ist
and
die
inseparably
neutestamentliche
connected to it
Bekenntnisbildung.
is the formation of the New
Anders als eine
Testament confession.
populärwissenschaftlich verbreitete Auffassung
Contrary to
besagt,
popular scholarly
handelt es sich
opinion,
dabei
this is
nicht
not
um
a
einen
process
Prozess
of
fortschreitender
progressive
Hochstilisierung des
stylization of
einfachen
the simple
Rabbi
Rabbi
Jesus zum
Jesus
Gottessohn,
as the Son of God,
sondern die
but rather
zentralen
the central
christologischen
Christological confessional
Bekenntnisaussagen stehen
statements
am
stand
Anfang
at the beginning
und sie stehen in engstem Zusammenhang
and in
auch mit
close
einer vertieften
connection
Einsicht in die sakramentale Gegenwart Christi
and
in
are
seiner Kirche.
dearly to the
Martin Hengel ist
sacramental
zuzustimmen, wenn er im Blick auf den
revelation.
Philipper-Hymnus,
Martin
der
Hengel is to be
Philipperbrief
agreed with what
ist
he
das Jahr
states with
50
regard
als
to the Philippian hymn.
ältester
It's
Brief
the oldest
des
letter and
Apostels
has
Paulus
been as the
bezeugt,
oldest letter
Der
of the
Philipper-Hymnus,
Apostle Paul around the year 50.
den Paulus bereits als
with the
geprägtes
Philippians hymn, which
Traditionsstück
Paul already
vorfand,
found as
ebenso
a
wie die
shaped piece of
Credo-Formel von
tradition,
1
as well as the
Korinther
credo
15,
formula of
3-5.
1 Corinthians
Ich zitiere Martin
15:35.
Hengel,
I
dass
quote
sich
Martin
in jenem
Hengel,
Zeitraum von nicht
that
einmal
in that
2
period of less than 2
Jahrzehnten, also vom
decades,
Ostereignis bis zur
that is,
Abfassung des
from the Easter
Philipperbriefes,
event to the
christologisch
writing
mehr
of the
ereignet hat als in
hymn,
den ganzen folgenden 7
more happened
Jahrhunderten
Christologically
zur
than in the
Vollendung
whole
des
of the following
altkirchlichen
7
Dogmas.
centuries until the
Diese
completion of the early
Überlieferung
church
umfasst
dogma.
das Bekenntnis und die Vergegenwärtigung des
Includes the
Heilshandelns
confession
in der sakramentalen
of the
Praxis der
sacramental
Kirche.
praxis of the Church.
Romano Guardini, einer der wichtigsten
Romano Guardini,
Gewährsmänner
one of
Joseph
Ratzingers
Ratzingers,
most important
hat in diesem
advisors,
Zusammenhang
has called
eine
for a
kopernikanische Wende
Copernican
gefordert.
turn in this
Guardini
context.
widerspricht
Guardini
einer
contradicts a
Basisannahme
basic
der
assumption
neuzeitlichen
of the modern
Religionskritik.
critique of religion.
Diese beruft sich
The latter
missbräuchlich auf
abusively
vermeintlich
invokes
gesicherte
supposedly
exegetische
secure
Forschungsergebnisse und
exegetical
behauptet,
research results
die
and
nachösterliche
claims that
Kirche
the
habe den
post-Easter
einfachen
church
religiös begabten
gradually
Jesus
overformed the
schrittweise
simple,
überformt
religiously
und
gifted
ihn damit
Jesus
zu einem
and thus
göttlichen Wesen
idealized him
idealisiert.
into a divine
Guardini
being.
gibt zu bedenken,
Guardini
dass es gerade
suggests that it is
umgekehrt
rather the
ist.
other
Das
way around.
apostolische Zeugnis
The apostolic
kann die
witness
ursprüngliche
can never
Fülle
fully
des
exhaust
Christusereignisses
the original
nie
fullness
voll
of the
ausschöpfen.
Christ
Ich zitiere,
event. I quote,
der Christus, den der
the
ernsthaft
Christ whom the
Glaubende
sincere
meint,
believer
ist
means
jener der
is the one
ursprünglichen
of the
Wirklichkeit.
original reality.
Die
The
Verkündigungen der
proclamations
Apostel
of
aber
the
sind
apostles,
Hinführungen
however,
zu
are
ihm und
introductions
bleiben
to
hinter
him
seiner
and
gottmenschlichen
always fall
Fülle
short of
stets
his
zurück.
God-human fullness.
Die Apostel
The
sagen
apostles
niemals
never say
mehr
more than the historical Jesus was, but always less. That is why everyone who reads the New Testament correctly feels that behind each of its sentences is a reality that shines forth and exceeds what is said, says Gordini in his contribution, The Human Reality of the Lord, in the year 1958. And he continues with a clear demand to exegetical science, I quote again, genuine biblical theology must therefore make a Copernican turn in relation to the rationalist attitude. Its scientific intention must not be to extract from allegedly exaggerated representations an equally allegedly simple first reality, but to make clear the original greatness from a series of representations, each of which is valid, but must always fail despite progressive deepening. So Gordini. From here it becomes understandable what is meant when Jesus says of the promised Paraclete, not only that he will remind the disciples of all that he has said to them, but that he will also introduce them into all truth. In the power of the Holy Spirit, all the implications of the revelation in Christ will be opened up to the Church. Therefore, conciliar decisions or papal decisions ex cathedra, which mark the progress of dogma, are not the practical application of preceding theories of dogma development, but elementary expressions of the life of the Church, carried by the Holy Spirit, for which its teaching authority is responsible. Catalysts of this development in the early days of the Church were almost exclusively heretical denials or false interpretations of the contents of the faith. The aforementioned Council of Nicaea in 325 had to respond to Arius' view, influenced by Hellenistic philosophy, that the Logos was a creature and non-eternal, a theory that would ultimately have called into question the redemption through the Logos and Son of God made flesh. The last two Marian dogmas, on the other hand, do not have a clarifying or defensive character, but rather a doxological, praising one. It is not possible to present here a complete exposition of all theories on the history of dogma. I will limit myself to some of the most important representatives. The Church owes its most intensive examination of the possibility and legitimacy of dogma development to St. John Henry Newman. His studies are not simply theoretically, but are set in the context of his existential struggle for the true Church. In his studies of the history of theology, something had become apparent with increasingly irrefutable force to the clergyman and university preacher highly respected in the Anglican Church and a member of the Oxford movement. Only in the Catholic Church has the faith founded in the biblical witness been preserved unaltered through the course of history. Critical points of doctrinal development from the point of view of an Anglican theologian were, in addition to the papal magisterium, above all Mariology and the veneration of saints, but also from an eschatological point of view, the doctrine of purgatory. Newman's teaching is not comprehensively systematically elaborated. The terms idea and principle play a central role in his teaching. In all doctrinal development, the idea, meaning the basic form of faith and its elements, which cannot be grasped down to the last concept, must be maintained. Another term closely linked to this is principle. In terms of content, filled first and foremost the principle of incarnation, which runs through all forms of expression of faith and is in turn closely linked to the principle of sacramentality. Newman's insights regarding a criteriology to distinguish legitimate doctrinal development from doctrinal corruption can be summarized in 7 points. Firstly, the preservation of typos. Newman illustrates this criterion with an example from biology. Young birds do not grow into fish. This corresponds to the image of the bud and the unfolded flower. Secondly, the adherence already mentioned to the respective principle, that is, the sacramental, the hierarchical, and the ascetic principle.
Ein drittes
A third
Kriterium für eine
criterion
stimmige
for coherent
Lehrentwicklung
doctrinal
ist die
development is
assimilierende Kraft. Das
assimilative
heißt,
power, that is,
wenn eine Lehre
when a
im
doctrine
Prozess der
expresses
Inkulturation
itself anew
sich
in the
neu
process of
ausdrückt
inculturation
und doch im
and yet
Prinzip
remains the
gleich
same
bleibt.
in principle.
Auch die logische
Logical
Folgerichtigkeit viertens ist
consistency,
ein
fourthly,
Kennzeichen,
is also a
ohne dass deswegen die
characteristic, without the
Dogmenentwicklung
development
mit einem
of
logischen
dogma being confused
Schlussfolgerungsverfahren
with a
verwechselt
logical
werden darf. Auch
process
das hat es
of
als Theorie
inference.
gegeben.
Also this has happened as a
Das
theory.
fünfte Kennzeichen
The
lautet
fifth characteristic is
Vorwegnahme ihrer
anticipation
Zukunft. Und
of
das
their
korrespondiert
future.
auch schon
And it
mit
already
dem sechsten
corresponds with the
bewahrende
sixth
Auswirkung auf die
preservative
Vergangenheit.
effect on their
Newman
past.
sagt, ich
Newman
zitiere,
says, I quote,
gehen einer
if a
Entwicklung bestimmte
development
Anzeichen
is
voraus,
preceded by
so
certain
spricht eine
signs, a
Präsumption für ihre
presumption
Echtheit.
speaks for its
Dagegen
genuineness.
ist eine
On the
Entwicklung
other hand,
sicherlich
a
korrumpiert,
development is certainly
wenn sie dem ihr
corrupted if it
vorausgehenden
virtually
Entwicklungsgang
contradicts and
der
reverses
ursprünglichen
the
Lehre
course
geradezu
of development
widerspricht und
of the
ihm
original
umkehrt.
teaching which preceded it. End
In
quote.
Anwendung dieses
In
sechsten
application of the
Kriteriums
sixth
kann man ganz
criterion, one can
ganz
formulate
aktuell
a
ein
very topical
Ausschlusskriterium
criterion
formulieren
of
für eine
exclusion
geforderte
for a required
Weiterentwicklung
further
etwa im Blick
development
auf die
with regard
Ehelehre.
to the doctrine of
Eine
marriage.
Lehrentwicklung im Sinne der
A
Ablösung
doctrine
der Ehe und
development in
ihrer
the sense of
Unauflöslichkeit durch
replacing
die Regel
marriage
von
and its
gelingenden Beziehungen,
indissolubility by
die im
speaking of
Rückblick das
successful
Martyrium eines
relationships,
Johannes des
which in
Täufers oder eines
retrospect would
Thomas
make the
Morus
martyrdom of a
als
John the Baptist or a Thomas
oder von
More
der Sache her
appear
eigentlich
unnecessary
gegenstandslos
or
erscheinen
actually
ließe,
irrelevant
kann nur
from the
als
point of view of the
Korruption
matter,
der
can only
Ehelehre
be regarded
betrachtet
as a
werden.
corruption of the
Das
doctrine of
siebte und
marriage.
letzte Kennzeichen lautet
The seventh and final
fortdauernde
characteristic
Lebenskraft.
criterion
Newman ist
is
davon
continued
überzeugt,
vitality.
dass eine
Newman is
Häresie
convinced
sich nur
that
kurze
a heresy
Zeit
can
halten
only
kann,
last
während
a
die
short time,
Fortdauer
while
ein weiterer
persistence
Prüfstein
is
für
another
eine
touchstone
getreue
for faithful
Entwicklung ist.
development.
Neben John Henry Newman steht Maurice
Alongside
Blondel,
John Henry Newman is to be seen Maurice
katholischer
Blondel, a
Philosoph,
Catholic
als
philosopher
tiefschürfender
who is a
Analyst der
profound
Dogmenentwicklung.
analyst of the development of dogma.
Seine Gedanken sind
His
niedergelegt,
thoughts
vor
are
allem in
set
der
down
Schrift
above
Geschichte
all
und
in
Dogma
the
von
book
1904,
History and
einer
Dogma
profunden
of the year
Auseinandersetzung mit
1904, a
Alfred Loisy.
profound debate with Alfred
Loisy hatte die
Loisy.
katholische
Loisy
Position
had actually
eigentlich
wanted
gegen
to
Harnack's
defend the Catholic
Infragestellung
position against
verteidigen wollen.
Harnack's
Seiner
questioning,
Entgegnung
but his
mangelt es
response
allerdings
lacked
an
a
einem
real
wirklichen
understanding of
Verständnis von
tradition
Tradition
as a medium of
als
transmission of divine
Überlieferungsmedium göttlicher
revelation,
Offenbarung,
which is
weswegen er
why
letztlich
he
nicht
was
zu Unrecht des
ultimately
Modernismus
accused,
bezichtigt
not
wurde.
unjustly, of modernism.
Blondel geht in Abgrenzung
Blondel,
sowohl zum
in contrast to both
Historismus
historicism
Harnack oder
of
Loisy,
Harnack and
wie auch zur
Loisy and the
extensivistischen Apologetik der
extrinsiktarian
damals
apologetics of the
vorherrschenden
then
Neuscholastik
prevailing
davon aus,
neo-scholasticism,
dass Offenbarung
one
nicht in
assumes
erster
that
Linie
revelation
Mitteilung
is
von
not primarily the
Satzwahrheiten ist,
communication
sondern
of
lebendige
propositional
Begegnung Gottes
truths,
mit den
but
Menschen
God's
zu
living
deren Heil.
encounter with people for their salvation.
Tradition ist dann aber mehr
Tradition
als das
is then more
Überliefern
than
einer
the
Summe
handing
von
down
nur
of a sum of
mündlich
Jesus'
überlieferten
words,
und eben nicht
customs, or
schriftlich
doctrines
fixierten
that have
Jesusworten
only been handed
von
down
Bräuchen
orally
oder
and not
Lehrsätzen.
written
Tradition
down. Tradition
ist der
is the comprehensive
umfassende Lehre
process
und sakramentales
of passing
Leben
on what has
umfassende
been
Prozess der
personally
Weitergabe von
entrusted,
persönlich
what has been seen, what has been heard.
Geschauten, Gehörten.
In
Im
the
Prozess dieser
process of this
Weitergabe aber kann
transmission,
es, und hier
however,
verweist Blondel, wie
there can
übrigens
be
auch
a
schon Newman,
gradually
auf die
maturing
marianische
of
Typologie in
insight
Lukas
and
2,50
understanding.
folgende,
And here Blondel, like
allmähliches
Newman,
Reifen der
refers
Einsicht
to the
und des
Marian
Verstehens
typology in
gegen
Luke
Maria,
2, verses 50
bewahrte
for
alles in
following.
ihrem Herzen und dachte darüber nach.
Mary
In
kept it
diesem
in his heart and thought about
Reifungsprozess, der
it.
nur unter der Führung des Heiligen Geistes
This maturing
denkbar ist,
process, which is only
ist beileibe
conceivable
nicht nur
under
das
the guidance of
schlussfolgernde
the Holy
Denken
Spirit,
beteiligt,
by no means
denn, so
only involves
Blondel,
reasoning.
die begriffliche
For,
Form
so
der christlichen
Blondel,
Dogmen
the
hat sich nur
conceptual
im
form
Schoß
of
einer
Christian
glaubenden
dogma has
Gemeinschaft
only been formed in
ausgeprägt
the bosom of a
und sie
believing
kann
community,
umgekehrt nur durch
and
lebendigen
conversely it can
Glauben
only be
belebt
enlivened
und
and developed by
weiterentwickelt
living
werden.
faith.
Und
And
das
in
Dogma
order
voll
to
und
fully
ganz
grasp
zu
the dogma,
begreifen, muss man
one must
virtuell
virtually carry within
die Fülle der
oneself
Tradition
the
der
fullness of
Kirche
the
in sich
tradition
tragen.
of the Church.
Ende des Zitats. Dabei
End of
geht
quote.
es nicht um das
This is
Ausdrücklichwerden
not
von
a matter
Irrationalem oder
of the
Unbewussten,
irrational or the
sondern
unconscious
des
becoming
Unterbewussten
explicit,
und noch
but of
Unreflektierten
the
sowie des
subconscious
vorläufig
and
noch
as
nicht
yet
auf das
unreflective,
ausdrückliche Denken reduzierbare.
as well as of that
Vor
which
diesem
for the time
Hintergrund
being
hat
cannot
Joseph
yet be
Ratzinger
reduced to
noch einen
explicit thought.
wichtigen
Against this
Baustein zum
background,
Verständnis
Joseph
unseres
Ratzinger has
Sachverhaltes
contributed
beigetragen,
another important
und
building
zwar im
block
Blick
to
auf
the
die
understanding of our
Terminologie.
facts,
Auch
namely
wenn sich
with
der
regard to
Begriff
terminology.
Dogmenentwicklung
Even though the
weitgehend
term dogma
eingebürgert
development
hat,
has become
bevorzugt
widely
er
accepted,
mit
he,
anderen
with others,
den Begriff
prefers the term
Geschichte statt
history
Entwicklung
instead
oder
of
gar
development,
Evolution.
or even
Das
evolution.
dahinterliegende
The
Anliegen ist,
underlying
jede
concern
quasi
is to exclude
apersonale
any
oder
quasi-apersonal
biologistische
or
oder
biologistic or
deterministische
deterministic
Sichtweise
view.
auszuschließen. Dogmengeschichte
The history
ist
of dogma
ein
is an event
zwischen dem sich
between the
offenbarenden dreifaltigen Gott
revealing triune
und der die
God
Offenbarung
and the Church,
annehmenden und im
which
Heiligen
accepts
Geist
the
immer tiefer
revelation and understands it
verstehenden
ever more
Kirche.
deeply in the Holy Spirit.
Die von Newman, Blondel und anderen
Taking up
Denkern
the
erarbeiteten
categories
Kategorien
developed by Newman,
aufgreifen,
Blondel, and other
spricht nun auch
thinkers,
das letzte
the last
Konzil
council
in der
now also speaks in the
Offenbarungskonstitution
Revelation
Dei Verbum
Constitution
davon,
Dei Verbum
dass die
of the
Kirche unter dem
fact that the
Beistand des
Church,
Heiligen
under the
Geistes einen
assistance of the
Fortschritt
Holy
kennt
Spirit,
im
knows
Verständnis
progress
des
in the
überlieferten
understanding
Glaubens.
of the
Zu
faith
diesem
handed down.
Wachstum tragen
According
gemäß der
to
Lehre
the
des
teaching
Konzils
of the
verschiedene
Council,
Faktoren
various
bei.
factors
Zitiere
contribute
Dei
to this
Verbum,
growth. I quote Dei
Artikel 8.
Verbum, Article 8.
Es wächst das
Every
Verständnis der
understanding of the
überlieferten
things
Dinge
and
und
words
Worte
handed down
durch das
grows
Nachsinnen
through the
und
reflection
Studium der
and study
Gläubigen,
of the
die sie in
faithful,
ihrem
who
Herzen
ponder them
erwägen,
in their hearts.
durch innere
Through
Einsicht, die aus
interior
geistlicher
discernment
Erfahrung
derived
stammt,
from
durch
spiritual
die Verkündigung
experience,
derer,
through the
die mit der
proclamation of
Nachfolge im
those who have
Bischofsamt
received the
das sichere
sure
Charisma der Wahrheit
charism
empfangen
of
haben.
truth with the succession
Das
to the
Konzil benennt
episcopate.
also 4 Quellströme
According,
gewissermaßen,
the council
aus
knows
denen sich ein
4
echter Fortschritt
currents
nähren muss.
that
Nachsinnen,
nurture
also
a
geistliche
true
Betrachtung
so
des gesamten
it's
Schriftzeugnisses.
thinking.
Zweitens dann das Studium.
The
Ja, auch
secondly,
die
the study.
Theologie
Yes,
hat
also
ihren
the
Beitrag zu
theology
leisten,
has to
eingebettet
give
in
its
das kirchliche Leben.
contribution.
Dann innere
And then
Einsicht, die aus
the
geistlicher
inner
Erfahrung stammt, das, was
thinking,
man auch Mystik nennt.
What one calls
Und
mystics,
insbesondere von den Heiligen
and especially
eingebracht
what is
wird.
brought from
All
the
das ist
saints.
fruchtbarer
All this is
Nährboden für wahre
fruitful
Lehrentwicklung.
soil for true
Und
development.
schließlich nennt das Konzil
And
ausdrücklich die
lastly,
Verkündigung der
the
Bischöfe,
council
die die
explicitly
ganze Bandbreite
speaks
der Heiligen
about
Schrift
the
ausschöpfen sollte und das Zeugnis der
proclamation of the
Kirchenväter,
bishops,
das
a
ausdrücklich
certain
hervorgehoben
examen,
wird in
development of
seiner
doctrine, and his
lebensermöglichenden Kraft. Woran das
life-giving
Konzil
force.
offensichtlich nicht denkt,
What the council
sind
did
von
not think of
Theologieprofessorinnen und Professoren sowie
from
vom Verbandsfunktionären
theology
verfasste
professors
Forderungskataloge
and
auf der
others
Basis einer
asked
Nichtrezeption oder gar Ablehnung der
demands
kirchlichen Lehre.
based on a non-reception of church
Gemäß Dei
doctrine.
Verbum 10 ist es dem
According to
Lehramt der
Dei Verbum
Bischöfe
10,
anvertraut,
it is entrusted to the
eine
magisterium of the
Lehrentwicklung
bishops
festzustellen,
to
zu
ascertain and
prüfen und
examine a
gegebenenfalls
development
für
of
verbindlich
doctrine
zu erklären.
and, if necessary,
Zitiere
to
noch
declare
einmal
it
Dei
binding.
Verbum
I quote
10.
again Dei Verbum
Die
10.
Aufgabe aber, das
But the
geschriebene
task
oder
of
überlieferte Wort
declaring
Gottes
the
verbindlich
written
zu
or handed
erklären,
down word of
ist
God
nur dem lebendigen
binding
Lehramt
is
der Kirche
entrusted
anvertraut,
only
dessen
to the
Vollmacht
living
im
magisterium
Namen
of the
Jesu
church,
Christi
whose authority
ausgeübt
is
wird.
exercised
Soweit
in the name of Jesus
Dei
Christ.
Verbum
So
10.
far, Dei Verbum 10.
Gegenwärtig nun
At present,
erleben wir freilich, wie ich eingangs schon
as I
erwähnt
mentioned at the
habe,
beginning,
eine
we
ganz
are
neue Situation.
experiencing a new situation.
Musste im Blick auf das protestantische Prinzip sola
In
scriptura und
view of the
die
Protestant
Verdächtigung
principle of
jeglicher
sola
Tradition
scriptura
als
and the
Menschenwerk,
suspicion of all
Legitimität von
tradition as the
Lehrentwicklung
work of
überhaupt
man,
begründet werden,
the legitimacy of
dann zeigte
doctrinal
sich
development
das
had to be
Lehramt im Blick
justified
auf
in the first
konkrete Fälle
place,
eher
and the
zurückhaltend
magisterium showed
defensiv,
itself to be rather
haben wir es
reservedly
gegenwärtig
defensive
umgekehrt
in
mit
view of
einer
concrete
Flut
cases.
von Forderungen nach
Conversely, we are
Weiterentwicklung der
currently
Lehre zu tun. Die
experiencing
Forderungen
a flood of demands for further
beziehen sich
development
gewiss auf
of
verschiedene
doctrine.
Ebenen, aber
The demands
einige
mentioned
betreffen
certainly
auch das
refer to different
Depositum
levels,
Fidei.
but some of them do concern the
Immer häufiger
depositum
bekommt man
fidei.
gerade auch im Zusammenhang
In the
des
context of the
synodalen
synodal
Weges
way,
entsprechenden Debatten
one is increasingly
entgegengehalten,
confronted with the question,
warum kann die
why
Kirche
can't the
diese oder
church
jene
change this or that
längst
doctrine,
angeblich veraltete oder
which
von
has
der
long been
Wissenschaft
allegedly
widerlegte
outdated or
Lehre nicht
disproved by
ändern?
science?
Sie hat doch alleine
In the
den
last
letzten
200 years
Jahren
alone,
so
the
oft
Church has
Lehren
changed
verändert,
so
dass das
many
Insistieren
doctrines
auf
that the
Kontinuität,
insistence on
die
continuity,
Berufung auf
the appeal to
diachrone Einheit nur als
diachronic
Strategie
unity
des
can only be
Machterhalts,
seen as a
als
strategy
Ideologie
for
diktierte
maintaining
Immunisierung
power as an
betrachtet werden muss.
ideology-dictated immunization.
Von systematisch-theologischer Seite werden
On the
diese
systematic
kritischen Anfragen
theological side,
besonders
these
von dem
critical
in Münster
inquiries
lehrenden
are
Dogmatiker
supported in
Michael Seewald
particular
unterstützt.
by the dogmatist Michael
Aber auch die
Seewald, who
Dissertation
teaches
des
in Münster.
Kirchengeschichtlers Matthias
But also the
Daufratshofer, die von
dissertation
Hubert
by
Wolf in
church
Münster
historian
betreut
Matthias
wurde,
Daufratshofer,
schlägt in diese
which was
Kerbe.
supervised by
Im
Hubert Wolf
Folgenden
in
sollen
Münster,
einige
also
Beispiele
takes
ihrer
this line.
Argumentation betrachtet
In the
und
following,
kritisch
some
hinterfragt
examples
werden.
of their argumentation will
Es
be
ist vor allem die
considered and
lehramtlich
critically
immer wieder in Stellung
questioned.
gebrachte
It is above all the necessity of
Kontinuitätsnotwendigkeit, die von Michael
continuity,
Seewald im Blick
which is
auf die
repeatedly put
vergangenen
forward by the
Jahrhunderte
magisterium,
erheblichen
that
Zweifel
Michael
gezogen.
Seewald
Er
casts
behauptet,
considerable doubt on in
im
view of the
Widerspruch
past two
zu aller
centuries. He claims,
Kontinuitätskosmetik
in contradiction
ließen
to
sich
all
unzählige,
cosmetics
ja,
of continuity,
unzählige
countless
Neuausrichtungen des
new
Lehramtes
orientations
beobachten,
of the
die von diesen
magisterium
allerdings
can be
gerne
observed,
getarnt werden,
which, however, however, are gladly camouflaged by the magisterium in order to maintain the appearance of an objective doctrinal tradition that manages without ruptures, end quote. And Sebald distinguishes three modes of this kind of cover-up or denied dogmatic development. They are explained by means of examples and provided with working terms. Autocorrection mode, an image from the computer world, oblivization, or rather oblivion mode, from the Latin oblivisci, to forget, thus the mode of letting oneself be forgotten, and the innovation obfuscation mode. Michael Sebald cites as examples the autocorrection mode had been effective in Pius XII's almost tacit and self-executing correction of the matter of the Sacrament of Holy Orders in the Apostolic Constitution Sacramentum Ordinis of 1947, where the stipulation of the Council of Florence that the presentation of the vasa sacra, that is the chalice and host, was the matter of the Sacrament of Holy Orders, and that was corrected to the effect that the matter, that is the external sign, was solely the laying of hands. The oblivion mode can be demonstrated, for example, in the tacit dropping, in the forgetting, in the simply not talking about it anymore with regard to the doctrine of monogenism, that is, that the entire human race descends from one pair of parents. In my opinion, it should be asked here whether the principle of the doctrine of monogenism is not, and that is just an accompanying, helping assumption for natural science, whether the principle is not the message of universal redemption through Christ. Christoph Schuelerkreis has rightly pointed out that only in the light of Christ's universal act of redemption did the extent and weight of sin in Adam become clear. Quote, only in the light of Christ does the full scope of original sin and its consequences appear. It is therefore not surprising that the Old Testament does not yet have a clear concept of original sin, end quote. That the human race is one, that it is therefore possible to determine unambiguously who is a human being, and therefore the bearer of inalienable rights is not only to be postulated against the background of the rejection of racism, but is also soteriologically necessary. If the unity of the human race, and thus the universality of the need for salvation, can also be made plausible without the scientific theory of monogenism, this theory is dispensable. What is decisive is that original sin is a New Testament theme, and of course also Old Testament theme, but first and foremost a New Testament theme, and ultimately arises from the idea of universal redemption of humanity through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. The innovation obfuscation mode comes into claims, or rather had its most prominent application in the Catholic Church's changed attitude to freedom of religion and conscience. The renunciation of several theses from the so-called syllabus and the concession of religious freedom by the Second Vatican Council. If the Church was able to change its teaching on religious freedom in the Second Vatican Council in the light of modern human rights declarations, then surely other innovations should also be possible in this context. This argument needs to be addressed. Benedict XVI, who had already advocated the meteorological and ultimately Christological justification of religious freedom at the Council as Cardinal Francis Peritus, points out an important consideration in the preface to Volume 7 of his collected writings. I quote, "From its inner ground, such a conception of religious freedom could not be alien to the Christian faith, which had entered the world with the claim that the state could not decide on truth and could not claim any kind of cult. But the interpretation of this right to freedom in the context of modern thought was nevertheless difficult, because it could seem as if the modern version of religious freedom presupposed the inaccessibility of truth to man, and thus, from its foundation, relegated religion to the realm of the subjective." So far Benedict XVI. Thus, it was not religious freedom as such that was questioned by the Church, but a relativism with regard to the knowledge of truth that underlay a liberalist understanding of freedom. In the doctrine of marriage, too, the new emphasis on the goals of marriage by the Second Vatican Council represents a considerable change compared to the encyclical Casti Connubii of 1931, and has not the Catholic Church fundamentally changed its relationship with Judaism and to Islam? To name just a few of the examples given to justify that the refusal to agree to doctrinal development demands can be nothing other than a strategy of maintaining power in view of the postulate of continuity. I can't refer to all these arguments at this point, although that would be possible logically and punctually, but I'd like to take up one current example. From the historical side, namely these arguments of Sebald are nourished by Hubert Wolf and Matthias Daufratshofer. In an interview with the Herder Correspondence of May 2021, Wolf surprises readers with the rehabilitation of Pope Pius XII. What serious historical scholarship, which does not rely on Rolf Hochhuth's Stellvertreter representative as its main source, has long known, has now also arrived in German church historiography. I quote Wolf, "The picture of Pius XII must certainly be drawn in a more multi-layered way than it is often done at present." End quote. However, the actual thrust of the contribution goes in a different direction. After the Pope has been freed from the dirt that also German historians had thrown at him, Wolf, referring to the dissertation written by his student Matthias Daufratshofer, began to build him up as now again satisfactory key witness for reform, as the title of this issue of Herder Correspondence puts it. In his work on the Pope's ghostwriter, that is, on the Jesuit priest Franz Hirt, Daufratshofer is said to show to what extent the supposed continuity of doctrine is a fiction, and even more so, to what extent the fiction of continuity is used communicatively in the assertion of magisterial claims. In his dissertation, Daufratshofer takes up the supposed redefinition of the laying on of hands as a matter of the sacrament of holy orders, mentioned by Sebald as an application of the autocorrection most, and at least asks the question whether a council decision is not being undermined here by an apostolic exhortation. In my opinion, however, the argumentation put forward by Sebald, Wolf and Daufratshofer cannot carry the burden attributed to it. Already in the year 1439, with regard to the Armenians, it was not demanded that the Eastern churches adopt the Catholic, scholastically dominated view, so that laying on of hands was recognized as a possible valid external sign of the sacrament of holy orders. Incidentally, the laying on of hands was always part of the ordination liturgy in the West as well. As is rightly said in Sacramentum Ordinis, the Church can change provisions which she herself has enacted. With regard to the reservation of ordination for men in Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, however, the Church knows herself to be bound by the practice of Jesus and the Apostles. And this is part of the idea and principle of the sacrament of holy orders, to use Newmanian terminology. On closer inspection, the history of dogma turns out to be more continuous than Sebald and Wolf would have us believe. In the next step, therefore, two concrete reform demands can now be considered. Reform demands from the perspective of the synodal way. In the doctrine of the episcopate and the priesthood, as is well known, the Second Vatican Council takes up the motive of the three munera, the three offices of Christ. In this way, the Council succeeds in establishing the unity of the sacra potestas conferred by ordination in the representation of Christ and the threefold ecclesiastical mission in the ministries of leading, sanctifying and teaching. As far as the demand for the limitation of episcopal authority through a separation of sacra potestas and jurisdictional power is concerned, it should be recalled that only recently the Second Vatican Council renewed and Christologically substantiated the doctrine of the episcopal office, in accordance with the great tradition of the Church, especially also of the Eastern Church. It was precisely the aim of the Second Vatican Council to deepen the unity and interpenetration of the three munera, teaching, sanctifying, governing, and their foundation in the Sacra Potestas. The synodality, constantly recalled by Pope Francis, is a mode of collegiality of the bishops and a way of realizing ecclesial communion, but it does not affect the leadership authority, governing authority, and responsibility of the Pope or the bishops. Dissolving this unity with regard to the image of the priest is also the goal of efforts on the synodal way, to bring lay people into church leadership positions to a much greater extent. A pioneer in this direction is the systematic dogmaticist Thomas Ruster, Emeritus from Dortmund, in his book Balance of Powers, from the year 2019. Ruster's guiding thesis is the task, quote, the task of teaching, sanctifying and leading, hitherto united in the office of the priest, will be divided among different persons. There is no longer just the one priest responsible for preaching, administering the sacraments and leading the congregation, but these tasks are exercised by different persons, end quote. The proposal, which is limited to presbyters and to the level of parishes, is highly problematic in several ways, though. The Christologically founded unity of Sacra Potestas and jurisdictional authority, which the Council was very concerned about, is dissolved again. This step of division would then be tantamount to a return to the Old Testament, in which the three offices were exercised by different persons. In the New Testament, all three offices are typologically related to Christ, in whose representation they're also exercised by the priest of the Church. However, the priest would, if one followed this proposal, would then be reduced to the office of the Kultbeauftragte, cult commissioner of the congregation. Last but not least, the power imbalance between bishop and the holders of the various offices would increase. And Thomas Marschler, in a critical response, has very lucidly pointed this out. The now camouflaged as a only question formulated demand for the admission of women to all degrees of ordination, which can be found in a meanwhile somewhat softened form in the basic test of the corresponding synodal form, to which I myself belong as a part of the vanishingly small minority, is not a further development of doctrine, but is in clear contradiction to the apostolic exhortation Ordinatio Sacerdotalis of Pope John Paul II of 22nd May 1994. Pope John Paul II, who declared that the Church has no authority to deviate from the practice of Jesus and the apostles of calling only men to the apostolic ministry. This doctrine was to be adhered to definitive. Pope Francis has reaffirmed this doctrine in a number of clear statements of varying weight, to be sure. A departure from it would represent a break with 2,000 years of tradition. Insisting on the above-mentioned demand carries the serious danger of a schism in the Church, not least for the East. The text of Synodal Forum 4 of the German Synodal Way, which deals with questions of anthropology and sexual morality, call for, quote, further development of the Church's sexual doctrine, end quote, or to work on a rejuvenation and updating of sexual morality, which would include a re-evaluation of sexuality and ultimately also a blessing of homosexual partnerships. The moral theologian Johannes Brandl from Trier, himself a member of this forum, has spoken out critically on this. After a wise and by no means one-sided weighing of the many points of view, in which he above all also resolutely rejects any disparagement or even hostility towards homosexual or transsexual people, Brandl nevertheless comes to the conclusion that the demands mentioned are not legitimate development of doctrine in the sense of organic growth, but rather a paradigm shift that exchanges the biblical view of sexuality as a creaturely default for a view that is oriented to its particular interests and certain societal expectations, instead of the scriptural and traditional values that are authoritative for the Church and also for biology as anthropological fundamental science. Speaking in Newman's terminology, the envisaged supposed further development is rather tantamount to a corruption of doctrine, because neither the underlying idea nor the principles have been preserved. For, quote, with clarity and certainty, according to Brandtl, it can be stated that sacred scripture consistently understands the deep tension and complementarity between women and man as a fundamental anthropological statement of creation. Connected with this is the conviction that sexuality is essentially under the sign and in the service of a comprehensive complementarity of the sexes, which in principle includes both the psychosocial maturation of the partners and biological fertility. In this respect, there is no evidence whatsoever within the Bible for a blessing of same-sex relationships based on Genesis 1:28 or by analogy with marriage or even by equating it with marriage. End quote. So much for a few initial comments on recent calls for further development of teaching. For the reasons mentioned, I agree with the judgment of Bishop Stefan Oster of Passau, who recently wrote in the international Catholic magazine Communio with regard to the demands of the synodal way, I quote, "In my view, the new formulations of doctrine are not simply further development, certainly not careful further development, as some bishops would like to see it, but rather a break. They are not gradual additions to existing doctrine, but essentially different." So far, Stefan Oster. Yes, there has always been doctrinal development. There were times when only a few held to the true doctrine, Athanasius in the 4th century, for example. But it is not the majority, but the identity of the typos and the principles that have to decide under the authority of the magisterium. And there will also be further doctrinal development. In view of the current demands, however, it seems to me that Newman's warnings against liberalism and against the dogma-free and thus completely untenable Christianity must be taken seriously. I quote, "Liberalism is the abuse of subjecting to human judgment those revealed doctrines which by their nature are above it and independent of it, and of claiming to determine for internal reasons the truth and validity of doctrines which rely for their acceptance simply on the external authority of the divine word." End quote. And beyond that, we have to regard that the spiritual preconditions, that is, the breeding ground for legitimate further development of the doctrine, do not seem to be sufficiently given in our latitudes and in our historical hour. And let us not forget, there has already been a considerable step in the past phase with regard to the further development of the anthropological preconditions and consequences of the creationliness of man and woman and the talk of sexuality. And that is John Paul II, the Holy Pope's theology of the body. That was a considerable step forward also in teaching. And we should first trace this. We should first catch up with this before talking about further developments. I summarize my reflections also in view of the current issues in the following 5 points. There is, according to Catholic teaching, a progression in the understanding of revelation. and it will be further progression. And there will be further progression. Continuity and identity, secondly, of the idea and the principles must be preserved so that the teaching is not corrupted. The identity must not be thought of organically or physiologically, but historically, personally. Thirdly, any possible progress must be embedded in the context of the whole understanding of the faith. Here we are reminded again of Maurice Blondel. In order to understand and develop dogma, one must virtually carry the fullness of tradition within oneself. If a quasi-definitive doctrine is to be turned into its opposite within only one generation, one can certainly not speak of legitimate doctrinal development. Fourthly, only a vital church with missionary strength and the fruits of growth in faith and social caritative works is the breeding ground for legitimate faith development. This is a serious request to the Church demands from Germany, that a shrinking church without missionary power should be the starting point for a worldwide renewal and further development of doctrine seems rather strange. Fifthly, for the further development of a doctrine, holiness is the best mother soul, and holy women and men are the best crown witnesses. Just look at St. John Paul II and the theology of the body. The recollection of the universal call to holiness in the 5th chapter of the Constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, is its heart and is this universal call to holiness is its heart and in most nobly the place where bishops, priests, religious and the many baptized and confirmed world Christians unite as the people of God on the way. And they can carry the torch of the faith into the future and will carry it to the future. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Herr Bischof, Exzellenz.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We have now 5 minutes before time, which does well to all of us, because we want to enter into dialogue in the pause. Taking into consideration the live broad streaming, I'd like to remind you to be back here latest at 16:27 in this room, so we can really restart at 16:30 sharp with the live broadcast. And the listeners and viewers of EWTN and Radio Horeb will be certainly happy to continue being here. And I'm hearing that also KTV will bring a contribution, so we greet them all very warmly. Thank you very much, and we will continue with the discussion. Correct, Your Eminence? Yes, thank you.
Gehen wir runter? Gehen wir runter? Wenn dann eine Frage kommt, dann ist gut. Aber ich glaube nicht.
Doch sagen, wir lassen
Meinst du, wäre es günstig? Alle 5?
Wir haben ja jetzt 3 Referenten. Wer setzt sich denn als 5. dafür? Als 4.?
Ich weiß es nicht.
Auch in den Voderholzer. Beim Graulich denke ich immer, wo ist die rote Hose?
Ja.
Immer gut, die Antwort.
Ja.
1:0.
So.
Deshalb haben Sie mich gestern noch nicht gesehen.
Ja.
Begrüßt. Ja. Wir dachten, hier.
Speak. Ja. Aber Sie fangen ja vorher an, oder wie geht das? Ja. Sie drücken da nicht wieder aus.
Nein. So, und wenn wir nachher sprechen,
Ja.
Speak.
Hier. Ja, eben.
Also, ich sag dann, wir verabschieden uns. Da kannst du ja Fußball nach oben. Ich hab das doch hier schon schön gemacht. Ne? Und die Genau. Ich weiß auch, was die Zuschauer Geschäft in Moll. Ja, jetzt geht's los. Oder?
Ja. Die Zuschauer.
Ja. Das ist doch schon.
Wer war denn für uns?
Der hat sich bereits als Übersetzer angesehen.
Ja.
Boah.
Ist das?
Was soll ich denn mal den Graulich sagen? Graulich mit roter Hose.
Ja.
Also, wo sind Sie doch hier, ne? Kann das sein? Also, nochmal. Ich lasse das Mikrofon an, weil Sie machen dann der Übergang. Wenn wir hier sitzen, der spricht uns auf den roten Knopf.
Wo ist der rote Knopf? Wo ist der rote Knopf?
Ja, ich sage es nochmal, weil
Wo ist der rote Knopf? Okay.
Ja, klar, deshalb gehe ich ja jetzt gerade her. Ja, vielen Dank. So, meine Damen und Herren, ich hatte gesagt 16:27 Uhr.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I had said 16:27, and on my watch it is 16:27. I'd be very happy if you all could take place, could take your seats. And I'd like to indicate if somebody has to leave the room in between, please use the back doors, those doors, and not here in front. Thank you. That would be very helpful. And now we will wait for the new. So I'll get a sign. An applause for Martin Rudolf of EWTN.
Damit das auf die Sekunde losgeht.
So we have to restart on the second precisely.
Sekunden haben wir noch? Zähl zurück. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen zurück.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our public symposium
beim Treffen der Schülerkreise
at the meeting
von
of the
Joseph
student circles of
Papst Benedikt XVI.
Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI,
Ich darf nochmal die Zuhörer
may
und Zuschauer
again
von
greet
Radio Horeb und
the listeners
EWTN
and
und
viewers
auch
of
KTV
Radio Horeb,
begrüßen
EWTN and
und
KTV,
natürlich Sie alle hier im
KTV,
Saal nochmal
and also you
herzlich
all here in this room.
herzlich danken dem Bischof
And
von Regensburg für den
I may thank again his Bishop
klaren,
of Regensburg
inhaltsreichen,
for
sehr
his
aktuellen
very
Vortrag,
rich,
den er uns eben
very
geschenkt hat.
up-to-date
Wir kommen jetzt
lecture
zu den
he
Statements
gifted
von
us, and now we come to
einigen
the
weiteren
speeches
Experten
of three further experts of our symposium.
Und ich darf noch mal kurz sagen,
And
wer
I
es ist. Das ist
may
zunächst
say again
einmal
who it
Prelate
is.
Dr.
This
Markus
is
Graulich,
Prelate Dr. Markus
der hier in
Graulich,
Rom arbeitet,
who is
aus
working
Deutschland
here in
kommt.
Rome,
Und
is
er
from
ist
Germany,
Untersekretär des
and he is the
Päpstlichen Rates für die
Undersecretary
Gesetzestexte und war mehrere
of the
Jahre lang als Richter auch an der
dicastery
Voderholzer
for the
tätig.
legislative text and
Und er
has
wird
worked for
gleich
several years at the
einen
Rotoromana, and he
uns
will
geben zum Thema Lehr- und
speak to the theme
Rechtstradition in der
doctrinal
Balance
and
zwischen
legal
Treue und
tradition and the
Veränderung.
balance between fidelity and change.
Prelate Graulich. Dann
Prelate
haben wir
Graulich.
als
Then we
nächsten
have the
den
next
Pater Dr. Uwe Michael Lang aus
Father
London.
Uwe Michael Lang from
Ich
London.
spreche Deutsch.
He speaks
Keine Sorge.
German, don't worry.
Er lehrt
He
in
is
London
teaching in London
und ist Herausgeber
and
von
is the
Antiphon,
editor
a
of
Journal
Antiphon,
for
a journal for liturgical renewal.
Habe ich das richtig formuliert? So heißt die
So
Zeitschrift.
that's the title of the
Und,
magazine.
wir sind sehr froh, dass
And
Sie
we're
da
very
sind,
happy
Pater
that you're
Lang,
here,
und Sie werden zu
Pater
uns
Lang,
sprechen.
and you will
Beten wir
talk
die
to us
Väter,
about
um
to
zu
pray
glauben,
as
wie
the
sie
fathers
geglaubt
did in
haben.
order
Lex
to
orandi
believe as
und
they
lex
believed, lex
credendi.
orandi, lex credendi.
Und wir haben dann den etwas
And we have
persönlicheren
then
Blick
The
auf
rather, a
Joseph
bit more
Ratzinger,
personal view on
Cardinal
Joseph Ratzinger,
Papst Benedikt
Cardinal Ratzinger,
XVI.
Pope Benedict
und von
XVI,
Prelate
by
Professor
Prelate
Dr. Helmut Moll
Professor
aus
Dr.
Köln.
Helmut Moll
Er ist Herausgeber
from
des
Cologne.
deutschen
He is the
Martyrologiums
editor of the
des
German
20. Jahrhunderts
Martyrology of the
und
20th
Professor für
century,
Exegese
and
und
he's professor for
Hagiografie.
exegesis and
Er hat lange in Rom
hagiography.
gearbeitet, in der
He worked for a long
Glaubenskongregation.
time in Rome at
Er
the
kennt Papst Benedikt
Congregation
sehr
for the
gut
Doctrine of
persönlich.
Faith, knows
Der
Pope
wird uns
Benedict
über die Wurzeln
very
der
well
Theologie des Denkens von Joseph
personally
Ratzinger,
and will
Papst Benedikt
speak to us about the
sicherlich
roots
sehr
of the theology and
interessante
thought
und,
of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict
uns
XVI.
erfreuende
Certainly very
Perspektiven
interesting
erschließen. Ich
and
freue mich
joyful.
sehr.
I'm very
Darf
happy.
nochmal darum bitten,
I
dass
may
die
again ask
Impulsgeber sich an die
you
Zeit
that
halten,
you keep to the allotted
damit wir
time
nachher auch die entsprechende
so
Podiumsdiskussion
we can
machen
afterwards
können mit
foresee
Ihnen und mit
the
den
discussion
Zuhörern und Zuschauern,
with those
die
on the
dabei
podium
sind.
and the
Herr
spectators who are
Professor
here.
Graulich, Sie haben
Professor
das Wort.
Graulich, you have the floor.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Eminenz, Exzellenz,
Your Eminence,
liebe Kolleginnen
Excellencies,
und Kollegen,
dear colleagues,
meine Damen und Herren.
ladies and gentlemen.
Die rechte Lehre und die
Right
rechte
doctrine
Lebensweise,
and the right way of life,
Orthodoxie
orthodoxy
und
and
Orthopraxie
orthopraxy
gehen in der
go
Kirche
hand in
als
hand in the
Gemeinschaft der
church
Glaubenden
as a
von
community
Anfang
of
an
believers
Hand in Hand.
from the very beginning.
Von den Ursprüngen der
From the
Kirche
origins
an
of the
werden
church,
in den
in the
Versammlungen der
gatherings
Apostel
of the
und ihrer
apostles and their
Nachfolger,
successors,
auf Synoden
at
und
synods and
Konzilien
councils,
Fragen
questions
der Lehre
of doctrine
und Fragen
and
der
questions of the
Glaubenspraxis
practice of
gemeinsam
faith
behandelt,
are dealt with together
den Alltag
in
der
order
Gemeinden
to be able
und deren
to cope
spezifische
with the daily life
Herausforderungen
of the
meistern zu
communities
können.
and their specific challenges.
Die Texte und die
The texts and
Dokumente,
documents
die wir aus
we
der
have
alten
from the
Kirche
early church
und aus der
and
Kirche
the
des
church of
Mittelalters
the Middle
besitzen,
Ages, therefore
enthalten daher
usually
in der Regel sowohl
contain
dogmatische
both
Aussagen
dogmatic
als auch
statements
rechtliche
and legal
bzw.
or
disziplinäre
disciplinary
Bestimmungen.
provisions,
Denn das eine
because
folgt aus dem
one
anderen
follows
und hängt
from
mit ihm
and is
zusammen.
related to the other.
Das Leben ist nicht vom
Life
Glauben.
cannot be
Der
separated from
Glauben
faith,
ist nicht vom
and
Leben
faith
zu trennen.
cannot be separated from life.
In den Texten der Konzilien
In
und
the texts of the
Synoden,
councils and
die
synods,
zunächst
which are
unterschiedslos
initially
als Kanon,
referred to indiscriminately
als
as
Messstab
canon,
oder
that is
festgesetzte
understood as
Ordnung
measuring
bezeichnet
rod
werden,
or established
werden
order,
die Wahrheit des
the truth of
Glaubens
faith
und die Normen
and the
für das
norms
Leben
for
aus dem
living by
Glauben
faith
demgemäß
are
gemeinsam
accordingly
überliefert.
handed down together.
Theologie und Recht
theology and law,
Lehre und Disziplin
doctrine and
werden
discipline
dabei
are
zwar
distinguished,
unterschieden,
but
aber nicht
not
eigentlich
actually
voneinander getrennt.
separated.
Diese Tatsache führt zu zwei
This fact
Fragestellungen.
leads to two questions.
Die erste Frage,
The first question
was
is,
tut die
what is
Kirche,
the church
wenn
doing
sie Theologie
when it
treibt
does
und wenn
theology
sie Dogmen
and
definiert?
when it defines dogmas?
Die zweite
And the
Frage,
second question,
was tut die
what does
Kirche,
the church
wenn sie
do
Recht setzt
when it
und
establishes
Normen
law
erlässt?
and enacts norms?
Eine vorläufige
A
Antwort auf
preliminary
diese
answer
Frage
to
kann
this
lauten,
question can be,
in der Theologie
in
vertieft
theology,
sich die
the
Kirche in
church
das
delves
Glaubensgut
into
der
the deposit
Offenbarung
of faith
und
in
versucht, dessen
revelation
Inhalt besser
and
zu
tries to
verstehen.
better understand its content.
Wenn sie Recht setzt,
When she
versucht
makes
sie
law,
das
she
Glaubensgut
tries to
und die
give the deposit of
Glaubenswahrheit,
faith and the
die
truth of
als
faith,
Wegweisung für das
which are
ewige Leben von
significant
Bedeutung
as a
sind,
guide to eternal
den
life,
Gläubigen als
to the
Norm für ihr
faithful
Leben
as a
vorzugeben
norm
und ihnen
for
dabei
their
zu
lives,
helfen,
and to
sie
help
als
them
Richtschnur
make
ihres
them
Lebens
the guide
einzuhalten.
of their lives.
Im Hinblick auf die Lehre
In terms
ist die
of
Offenbarung
doctrine,
Gegenstand
revelation
von
is the
Theologie und
subject
Lehramt.
of theology and the magisterium.
Vor dem Hintergrund der
Against the
theologischen
background of
Reflexion
theological
stellt das
reflection,
Lehramt den
the magisterium
verbindlichen Inhalt
establishes
der
the
Offenbarung
binding
fest
content of
und bedient
revelation
sich dabei einer
using
indikativen Sprache.
indicative language.
Dogmen sagen uns,
Dogmas
was
say
ist.
what is.
Sie sind
They
der
are
definitive Ausdruck
definitive
dessen, was wir
expressions
glauben.
of faith.
Es ist die spezifische
It is the
Aufgabe des
specific
Lehramtes,
task of the
die
magisterium
Offenbarung in
to
die
translate
Eindeutigkeit von
revelation
Begriffen zu
into
übersetzen,
unambiguous
um das
terms
ans Licht zu
in
bringen,
order to
was
bring
gemeint
to
ist,
light what is
und
meant
den Gläubigen
and
dadurch
to offer
eine zuverlässige
reliable
Orientierung zu bieten.
orientation to the faithful.
Dabei kann es im Laufe der
In
Jahrhunderte
doing so,
zu
a
einer
deepened
vertieften
knowledge of the
Erkenntnis des
deposit of
Glaubensgutes
faith
kommen,
can occur over the
aber es
centuries,
können weder der
but no new
Offenbarung neue
content
Inhalte
can be added
hinzugefügt,
to revelation,
noch von ihr
nor can
Inhalte
content
weggenommen
be
werden.
taken away.
In diesem Sinn
In
sind
this
die von der
sense,
Theologie
the dogmas
erarbeiteten
elaborated by
und vom
theology
Lehramt definierten
and defined by the
Dogmenwahrheiten,
magisterium
die in
are
der göttlichen
truths
Offenbarung enthalten
contained
sind,
in divine
die
revelation
mit diesen
or
in notwendigen
necessarily
Zusammenhang
related to it.
Im Gegensatz
In
zur
contrast
theologischen
to
Forschung
theological
und zum
research
Lehramt mit seiner
and to the
indikativen
magisterium
Sprache
with its indicative
das
language,
Kirchenrecht
canon
eine
law
imperative
uses
Sprache.
imperative language.
es sagt,
It
was
says
getan werden
what
soll.
is to be done.
Lehramt und Theologie
Magisterium and
bewegen sich
theology
weitgehend
move
im Bereich
largely
der
in the realm
Erkenntnis
of knowledge
und bemühen sich
and
darum,
strive
das
to
Geheimnis des Glaubens
understand
zu
the mystery
verstehen,
of faith,
Kenntnisse
to
zusammen
gather and
und sie zu
systematize
systematisieren.
knowledge.
Das Lehramt
The
hilft bei
magisterium
dieser
helps in
Aufgabe,
this task
indem es diese
by
Erkenntnisse,
expressing this
wenn sie sich
knowledge
bewährt haben,
when it has proven
in
itself
lehramtlichen
in
Dokumenten zum
magisterial
Ausdruck bringt.
documents.
Theologie und Lehramt
Theology
haben es
and the
daher mit
magisterium
Begriffen
are concerned
mit
with
Konzepten
terms
zu tun.
and concepts.
Dem Kirchenrecht geht
Canon
es
law
mehr um die
is more
Vermittlung
concerned
dessen,
with
was dabei
communicating
zutage tritt.
what comes to light in the process.
Es hat die Aufgabe,
It has the
Gesetze zu
task of
schaffen,
creating
die der
laws
Gemeinschaft der
that help the
Glaubenden
community
helfen,
of believers
sich jene
to
Inhalte
appropriate
anzueignen,
those
welche der
contents
Offenbarung
that correspond
entsprechen,
to
damit sie
revelation
ihr Leben
so that
danach
they
ausrichten
can orient their lives accordingly.
Während also das Lehramt
While the magisterium
Orthodoxie
ensures
sicherstellt,
orthodoxy,
gibt das
canon
Kirchenrecht
law
eine Antwort auf
provides
die
an
Frage
answer to
nach
the
der rechten
question
Lebensweise,
of right
nach der
practice,
Orthopraxie.
orthopraxy.
Es fragt,
It asks,
welche sind die
what are the
Elemente
elements
kirchlicher Lehre
of
und
church
kirchlichen
doctrine
Lebens,
and church
die einer
life
rechtlichen
that
Regelung
require
bedürfen?
legal regulation?
Und wie können sie
And
so
how can
rechtlich
they
gefasst
be
werden,
legally
dass sie
formulated
wirklich im
in
Dienst
such a
des
way
Glaubens
that they are
und
truly
des
at the
Lebens aus dem
service
Glauben
of
stehen?
faith and life from the faith?
Jeder Rechtssatz der Kirche
Every legal
ist daher
sentence
von einer
disposition of the
theologischen
church
Vorentscheidung
is
geprägt.
therefore shaped by a preliminary
Kirchenrecht
theological decision.
ist keine freie
Canon law
Setzung des
is not a
kirchlichen
free
Gesetzgebers,
creation of the ecclesiastical
Recht
legislator,
ausgewachsener
but
Überlieferung.
law from grown tradition.
Joseph Ratzinger hat diese Tatsache
Joseph
im
Ratzinger
Vorwort zu einem Buch
aptly
über
summed up this
Rechtstheologie
fact in the
treffend auf den
preface
Punkt
to a
gebracht.
book on legal theology.
Das Recht der Kirche hat,
The law
so
of the
schreibt
church
er,
has, so he
sich aus der
writes, quote,
Glaubensüberlieferung und aus
developed
der
out of the
sakramentalen
tradition of
Überlieferung
faith and out of the sacramental tradition, largely in connection with the ecumenical councils. Accordingly, codification is a collection and sifting of tradition, but at the same time an act of its further enfolding." End quote. What this means can be explained with regard to the currently valid ecclesiastical code of law, the Codex Iuris Canonici of 1983. In it, the ecclesiastical legislator has presented what is laid down in Revelation against the background of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. He translated their contents into norms according to the method and in the language of law in order to make them effective in the life of the Church. Thus, Saintly Pope John Paul II was able to write in the Apostolic Constitution promulgating the Code, quote, "If the Second Vatican Council has drawn from the treasure of tradition the old and the new, it is evident that the Code incorporates the same characteristic of fidelity in novelty and novelty in fidelity, and adapts itself to this characteristic according to its own content and specific mode of expression." This could now be illustrated by various examples. I will limit myself here to marriage law. In Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council, in continuity with tradition, underlined the personal dimension of the marriage covenant and presented marriage as intima communitas vitae et amoris, as an intimate communion of life and love. This theological deepening constitutes the basis for the new marriage law, in the formulation of which, as Pope Benedict XVI once stated, quote, "Efforts have been made to reform or renew while maintaining continuity." End quote. These efforts have developed on the basis of the indisputable premise that marriage possesses a truth of its own, to the discovery and deepening of which reason and faith together contribute harmoniously, that is, human knowledge enlightened by the Word of God of the sexual difference between man and woman, with its profound desire for mutual complementarity, definitive commitment and exclusivity. So far Pope Benedict. Law in general, and canon law in particular, does not have the task of formalizing subjective demands or sentiments or of following constantly changing majorities. The norms of canon law are bound to revelation and the theological foundations arising from it, which the living magisterium of the Church presents. They serve the people of God to direct themselves towards the goal given to them by the Lord. Just as faith cannot do without the confession of the doctrines of faith, but is not exhausted therein, so the practice of faith cannot do without the standard of the law, but is not limited to it. The greatness and limits of dogma and canon law lie in the fact that they point beyond themselves to the reality of salvation and the justice of salvation that lies in the event of revelation. Dogma and canon law, the faith and legal order of the Church, serve the salvation of souls. They are by no means to be understood as the burden of the law, but lead to grace and to that justice which comes from grace. Both share in the mediation of salvation without being able to mediate salvation themselves. According to Augustine, The law was given in order to find grace, and grace in order to fulfill and understand the law rightly. According to Thomas Aquinas, although grace and law are related to each other, one cannot take the place of the other, for grace is always the reality embracing the law and therefore has priority. Or, to use the words of John Paul II once again, canon law does not have the task, quote, to replace in the life of the Church the faith, grace, charisms, and above all the love of the faithful. On the contrary, the Code aims rather to give ecclesial society an order which gives priority to charity, grace, and the charism, while facilitating their orderly progress in the life of ecclesial society as well as of the individuals who belong to it." End of quote. The law of the Church is grounded, mediated through theology and the magisterium, in the revelation that comes to us through Scripture and tradition. Law thus becomes the indispensable instrument for personal and communal life in the Church, to which it gives order. Changes in the legal order, therefore, presuppose a deeper theological knowledge of revelation and the dogmas defined by the magisterium. Where ambiguous dogmatic definitions are lacking, the law cannot create unambiguity either. This fact became very clear during the drafting of the currently valid Code of Canon Law. Thus, during the drafting of the marriage law in the Code arose the question, can one really say that every marriage between baptized persons is always also a sacrament at the same time? The Reformed Commission's answer to this question is very clear. It is not the task of the law to decide this question. As long as the theological question is not answered by the competent authority, the law must adhere to what is generally accepted theologically. As the discussions of our days show, this question has remained open until today theologically and from the point of view of law. The content of canon law, its material dimension, develops according to the definitions made by the Church's magisterium. As far as the form of canon law is concerned, that is its formal dimension, there are greater possibilities for development. In history, the norms of the Church were first formulated in the tradition of Roman law. Later, principles of Germanic legal systems were added, and canon law became a synthesis of both legal systems. With the evangelization that extended to the Americas, Asia and Africa, new possibilities arose once again in formal regard, as well as new necessities. While the law was initially set by decisions of councils and synods and later by the Pope's decrees, at the beginning of the 20th century, as before in the states of Europe, in the universal legal order in the Church, to summarizing in a code, which was supplemented by further laws. The balance between faithfulness and development is maintained thus, as only the outward form of the laws has changed. Thus, today's code, which is based on the juridical and legislative heritage of revelation and tradition, is to be regarded as an indispensable instrument, by means of which the necessary order both of personal and social life and of activity in the Church itself is preserved. Regardless of its external, formal form, canon law is bound, on the one hand, to that theological foundation which gives its legitimacy, legitification, and which is the essential legal ground of ecclesial legitimacy. On the other hand, it must correspond to the changing realities of the historical reality of the people of God. For this to succeed, the formulations must be clear and without ambiguity. Outdated norms must be modified, and all norms interpreted in the light of the authentic magisterium of the Church. With regard to the doctrinal and legal tradition of the Church, St. Anselm's dictum, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeks understanding, can be extended by two sentences. Fides quaerens actionem, faith seeks action, the practice of lived life, and
Fides quaerens determinationem.
Fides quaerens determinationem, faith seeks orientation, faith needs law.
Dadurch bleiben Lehre und Recht,
doctrine and law, dogma and canon law remain referred to each other and develop together in the conviction that every duty of the Christian has its ground in being in Christ. If this being is rightly understood, it is affirmed in life and thus becomes the canon, direction and standard measuring rod of life. Canon law provides the framework so that the people of God can effectively direct itself towards its goal. In this, the law of the Church is, to quote again Pope Benedict, above all lex libertatis, a law that sets free to follow Jesus. It is closely linked to the teaching and life of the Church to safeguard the delicate concerns of the things of God, to protect the rights of the weakest, of those who have no other power to assert themselves, but also to defend those special goods which every believer has received gratuitously, the gift of faith, God's grace above all, and which cannot remain in the Church without protection from the law. So Pope Benedict XVI, when the Code was celebrating its 25 years, 1983. The protection of the rights of the weakest is a keyword that leads back to the connection between law and theology and their development. In his New Year's Eve sermon of 1979, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger had described the task of the magisterium as follows with very similar words. He said, "The Church's magisterium protects the faith of the simple, of those who cannot write books, speak on television, or write editorials in the newspapers. That is its democratic mandate, to give voice to those who have none." End of quote. Law and theology, canonical norm and magisterial decision go hand in hand and develop together, ultimately to protect the salvation of souls, which must be supreme law in the Church. Canon law, if it is understood in the manner described, in the right way, has an important task to fulfill for the life of the faithful. It vividly demonstrates that faith is far more than a theory. Faith seeks not only understanding, but also action and therefore reliable orientation. This finds expression in the norms of law, in which the balance between faithfulness and change is maintained. Thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Herr Prälat Graulich. Ich gebe das Wort an Pater Lang.
Thank you very much, Prelate Graulich. I'm handing the floor to Father Lang.
Eminenz, Exzellenz,
Your Eminence, Excellencies,
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Dear brothers and sisters,
am Beginn
ladies and
dieses
gentlemen,
kurzen Beitrags steht
this short
ein
contribution
Überblick
begins with an overview of the origin and impact of the often quoted axioms lex orandi, lex credendi. As a next step, based on Joseph Ratzinger's definition of right as a rule and gift, Vorgabe to the Church, we'll discuss the importance of communion in worship across the generations, especially for our time. In this context, I cannot avoid addressing the question of the relationship between continuity and rupture in the liturgy. Finally, I want to outline how a rereading, relecture of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution Sacrosanctum Concilium, as proposed by Ratzinger, can point beyond this controversial discussion. When the relationship between liturgy and faith is discussed, sooner or later mention is made of the axiom lex orandi, lex credendi, which is often rendered in the form, the law of prayer is the law of faith. Put this way, the phrase suggests an interchangeability of the two elements of the sentence and thus a reciprocal relationship between them. However, lex orandi, lex credendi is a simplified paraphrase of a principle whose original formulation can be found in a short tract written in the 5th century in connection with the controversy over Augustine of Hippo's theology of grace, the so-called semi-Pelagian controversy. This treatise was attributed to Pope Celestine I and was handed down as Indiculus de Gratia Dei in the collection of papal decrees compiled by Dionysius Exiguus in the 6th century, which explains the text's wide reception in history. Recent research, however, attributes the work to Prosper of Aquitaine, and it was probably intended as a theological memorandum for Sixtus III, after Julian of Eclanum, the fierce critic of Augustinian theology of grace, traveled to Rome in 439 to plead his case before the Pope, but to no avail. In the 8th chapter of the Indiculus, the author refers to the doctrinal decisions of the Apostolic See and adds, quote, "But let us also take into account the right of priestly intercessions, which, handed down by the apostles, are celebrated in the same way throughout the world and the entire Catholic Church, so that the law of prayer may determine the law of faith. Ut legem credendi, lex statuat supplicandi." Unquote. Prosper here explicitly links the law of prayer, lex supplicandi, with priestly intercessory prayer, obsecrationis sacerdotales, and his choice of words, sacramenta, celebrantur, points to a liturgical Sitz im Leben for these intercessions. The note about the apostolic origin of such intercessory prayer probably refers to the 2nd chapter of the 1st letter to Timothy. The setting of the semi-Pelagian controversy suggests that Prosper sees in the apostles' instruction to pray for all people, that they may come to the knowledge of the truth and thus to eternal salvation, a proof of the necessity of grace. Prosper does not restrict the determining force of the lex supplicandi for the lex credendi to general intercessory prayer. And the following chapter of the Indiculus, he refers to the baptismal liturgy, especially its rites of the exorcism and exsufflation, as evidence of original sin. The widely practiced baptism of children also supports his argument. Like his teacher Augustine, Prosper sees in the fact that the Church baptizes newborn children an expression of the need for the washing away of original sin, and thus a proof for the latter's existence. Finally, it should also be mentioned that for Prosper the lex supplicandi has a strong ecclesial dimension, for it expresses the sense of faith of the whole Church. While in Prosper lex supplicandi is still limited to priestly intercessory prayer and the practice of baptism, Thomas Aquinas extends and I'm using it as an example here, he extends the principle to the entire liturgical activity of the Church. Thomas places the authority of the liturgy as the custom of the Church, consuetudo ecclesiae, above the authority of the Fathers in matters of dispute. Thus, worship in its concrete ritual form is not simply subject to theological reasoning. Rather, in addition to the well-known series by Matteo Cano from the 16th century, it can be counted among the Loci Theologici, the sources for the doctrine of faith. If there is a conflict between liturgical practice and theological reflection, then the latter needs to acknowledge the former, albeit with the important restriction that the practice of worship must be in harmony with the teaching of the Church. In his writings on the liturgy, Joseph Ratzinger has deepened our theological and spiritual understanding of the relationship between lex orandi and lex credendi. His preface to Theology of the Liturgy, the volume that began the publication of his collected writings in 2008, includes a brief reflection on the fullness of the meaning of the term orthodoxy, in which, I quote, "The second half, doxa, does not mean idea, but rather glory, Herrlichkeit. It is not a matter of the right idea about God, rather it is a matter of the right way of glorifying Him, of responding to Him, for that is the fundamental question of the man who begins to understand himself correctly. How must I encounter God?" Unquote. Orthodoxy is thus conceived as the glorification of God, which places man in the right relationship with God and thus begins to shape his whole life. In his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, Joseph Ratzinger elaborates on the importance of the right worship of God. The liturgy expresses the Christian faith's understanding of God and the world, and it prepares us beyond all human weakness and limitation to meet the Lord, who, in his Paschal mystery, draws us to himself and calls us to communion. In a text written only a few months before his election as successor of Peter, Joseph Ratzinger presented the following definition of the term rite, quote, "The rite, that form of celebration and prayer which has ripened in the faith and the life of the Church, is a condensed form of living tradition, in which the sphere using that rite expresses the whole of its faith and its prayer, and thus at the same time the fellowship of generations, one with another, becomes something we can experience. Fellowship with the people who pray before us and after us. Thus the rite is something of benefit, which is given to the Church, a living form of paradosis, the handing on of tradition," unquote. Of particular importance for our topic are the diachronic elements of a rite, which Ratzinger elsewhere calls praying with the Fathers and the Apostles. It is undoubtedly a characteristic of the Christian faith to refer continually to the teaching and practice of the age of the Church Fathers, who do not bear this title by chance. However, an exclusively patristic ressourcement is not sufficient, as the example of the Anglican Oxford movement shows. The Oxford movement contended that the Church of England, as one of the branches of the undivided early Church, best preserved the teaching of the patristic age and thus represented the via media, the middle way between the errors of Protestantism and the distortions of Roman Church. It was John Henry Newman's great insight that this recourse to Christian antiquity, on which the theory of the via media rested, ignored the development of doctrine in history. Such development already took place in the Apostolic Age and continued authentically in medieval and modern times. In the doctrine of the Catholic Church. As Newman notes in his essay on the development of Christian doctrine, this applies not only to the doctrine of faith but also to worship. To borrow an image from the great English theologian, in the history of ideas, a river is clearest not at its source, but only when it has already traveled some distance, as its bed has gained in breadth and depth, and it has become a powerful stream. In this context, a difficulty is raised by the narrowing of the concept of church father in the 20th century, as Hubertus Drobner has pointed out. The limitation of the concept of father to antiquity dates only from modern times. Jean Mabillon, 1632 to 1707, still regarded Bernard of Clairvaux, died 1153, as the last of the fathers. Accordingly, the print series published by Jacques-Paul Migne in the 19th century, Patrologia Latina, ends with Pope Innocent III, died 1216. This broader concept of church father underlies the bull Quo Primum, with which Pope Pius V promulgated on 14th of July 1570 the first post-Tridentine edition of the Missale Romanum. In Quo Primum, Pius V states that the Missal had been restored according to the original norm and rite of the Holy Fathers, ad pristinam sanctorum patrum normam agritum. Thus, ancient ecclesiastical tradition is, in its ritual expression, declared to be the norm, according to which the immediately preceding editions of the Missal were purified of rank growth as envisaged by the Council of Trent. However, as Joseph Andreas Jungmann notes, it is taken for granted that the entire development of the intervening period, which set contemporary practice apart from the norm of the Fathers, should not be pushed aside, insofar as it did not disturb in the basic plan, but rather enfolded it in moderation. In fact, the Tridentine Missal continues the Romano-Frankish tradition, reaching back to the Ordines Romani of the early Middle Ages, which began to spread through the Latin Church from the pontificate of Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085 onwards. The Council, Emeritus Joseph Ratzinger, followed in the spirit of Newman's hermeneutic of the development of doctrine and worship in his internationally acclaimed speech at the German Catholic Congress, Katholikentag in Bamberg in 1966. Ratzinger was one of the few but notable voices who posed critical questions about the post-conciliar liturgical reform, even in its early enthusiastic years. In his analysis, he showed the ambivalence of a liturgical purism that turned from the revival of a supposedly classical form, in this case the Roman Rite before the Carolingian reform, into an unbridled desire for innovation. In this process, the spiritual and cultural deepening that the liturgy experienced in the Middle Ages and, in some respects, in the Baroque period, fell by the wayside. Such an approach does not do justice to the organic, if occasionally meandering, historical development of the liturgy. As Ratzinger stated pithily, mere archaism does not help, and mere modernization even less. The debate on continuity and rupture in liturgical development has lost none of its relevance and is being conducted not only in academic discourse, but also before a wider public. Joseph Ratzinger encouraged a new generation of scholars to question the prevailing paradigm that the history of the Roman Mass moved from early dynamic development through medieval decline to early modern stagnation. Ratzinger's important contributions also stimulated critical reflection on the liturgical reforms of the 20th century and a clear-headed look at the current state of Catholic worship. In his pontificate, Benedict XVI was keenly aware that the manifest ruptures in the ritual practice of the Church since the Second Vatican Council had created a situation in which a reintroduction of traditional liturgical forms with papal authority would be widely perceived as a new rupture. By opening up possibilities without making them obligatory, Benedict wanted to create favorable conditions for a further organic development of the Roman Rite. The theological foundation for these practical measures of this pontificate can be found in a rereading, relecture of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which Joseph Ratzinger outlined in a lecture on the 40th anniversary of Sacrosanctum Concilium in 2003. in Trier. He distinguishes between two levels running through the conciliar constitution. In the first place, it develops principles that quite fundamentally and generally concern the nature of liturgy and its celebration. Secondly, and based on these principles, the document gives normative instructions for the practical renewal of the Roman liturgy. For Ratzinger, these valid instructions are more products of their time than the statements of principle. A third level is added with the concrete implementation of the reforms by the Concilium for the implementation of the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. Ratzinger underlines the binding nature of these forms of liturgical renewal established by church authority. But he also notes that they are not simply identical with the Council as such. Within the framework set by the Council, different realizations are permissible, and whoever does not think that everything in this reform turned out well and considers many things in need of revision is not therefore an opponent of the Council. Rather, the conciliar text needs to be newly contextualized, that is, read in the light of its impact in recent history and of our present situation. This hermeneutic can offer a key to understanding Pope Francis' call in his recent apostolic letter on the liturgical formation of the people of God, but continually to rediscover the richness of the general principles exposed in the first numbers of Sacrosanctum Concilium, end quote. In doing so, looking back at a period of almost 60 years, the strengths and weaknesses of the liturgical reform should be openly discussed. Even if the concrete implementation of the conciliar constitution was overseen by holy popes, it does not engage the infallibility of the Church as matters of faith and morals. Neither does the liturgical reform of St. Pius V after the Council of Trent. In view of the close connection between lex orandi and lex credendi, it must also be possible to ask from a broader perspective whether the actual reordering of divine worship was carried out in every respect in the obedience of faith and with reverent attention to the mystery of the liturgy, and thus satisfied the criteria that Joseph Ratzinger presented with reference to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Pater Lang. Ich darf jetzt
Thank you very much, Pater Lang, and I may now ask Pater Prelate Dr. Helmut Moll to take the floor.
Und auch da freuen wir uns.
And also this we delight in. Your Eminence, Excellence,
meine Damen und Herren,
dear brothers, ladies and gentlemen, roots of the theology and thought of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. I have, in my short lecture, uncovered 4 sources. Firstly, growing up in his family in the Bavarian world. During an interview on a flight to Germany on 22nd September 2011, Pope Benedict was asked, "How German does Pope Benedict still feel?" His answer, Hölderlin said, "Birth is the most powerful thing. And of course I feel that too. I was born in Germany. And the root cannot be cut off and should not be cut off." For his childhood and youth, Pope Benedict finds the following words in his 1997 memoirs, quote, "Peasant life was still joined together in a firm symbiosis with the faith of the Church. Birth and death, marriage and illness, sowing and earning, everything was enclosed by faith. Even if personal life and thought by no means always corresponded to the faith of the Church, no one could have imagined dying without the Church, or even the great events of life without it. Life would simply have gone nowhere. It would have lost the sustaining place that held it and gave it meaning." End quote. The circumstance of his baptism on a Holy Saturday opened a wide horizon of understanding of the tragedies of the 20th century for Pope Benedict. On the very morning of his birth, 16th April 1927, his father carried him to the parish church of St. Oswald in Marktel am Inn. Because of the grim cold, his older siblings were denied the opportunity to accompany their father. Little Joseph thus became the first to be baptized with the new water of the Easter Vigil. Pope Benedict attributed great significance to this providence. That my life was immersed in the Paschal ministry in this way from the very beginning has always filled me with gratitude, for it could only be a sign of blessing. Of course, it was not Easter Sunday yet, but Holy Saturday. But the longer I think about it, the more it seems to me to be in keeping with the nature of our human life, which is still waiting for Easter, which is not yet in full light, but is nevertheless confidently heading towards it. Secondly, the liturgy of the Church. Many of you know about the preserved letter of the young Joseph Ratzinger to the Christ child from Advent 1934. Little Joseph was 7 years old at that time. He promised the Christ child to always be good and told him his wishes. He wished for among other things, for a Volksschott, a liturgy book. This childlike wish reveals the liturgy as a deep constant in the life of Pope Benedict XVI. In his memoirs, he mentions the beneficial and ordering rhythm of the church year in its feasts and celebrations. He remembers that a liturgical movement that brought him. It was a captivating adventure to slowly penetrate the mysterious world of the liturgy that was happening for us there at the altar. It became clearer and clearer to me that I was encountering a reality which had not been conceived by anyone, which had not been created by an authority or a great individual. This mysterious web of text and action had grown out of the faith of the Church over centuries. It carried the freight of all history and yet was at the same time much more than the product of human history. This basic experience had to withstand stormy times. In the period after the Second Vatican Council, the liturgy threatened to fall into the disposal of the congregation, to become a human doing and no longer to work God's action on man. But Ratzinger's early basic experience had an extremely clarifying effect. Years after the end of the Council, when the dust settled, Pope Benedict XVI made an effort to contribute to the objectification of the discussion. He said, in dealing with the liturgy, the fate of faith and the Church is decided. Thus, the liturgical question has gained an importance today that we could not have foreseen in the past. For Pope Benedict, however, the liturgy in its unavailability and its advance does not show itself as a cold and immovable block. In a 1984 article in the International Catholic newspaper Communio, he recalled the great work of Romano Guardini, entitled Liturgical Formation. He said, quote, "Today people often try to shape liturgy in such a way that reflection beforehand and education towards it are no longer needed, because they want to give it the most superficial form of comprehensibility. But we need the form to quickly remain in eternity that fades away. As if under a burning glass, Pope Benedict's relationship with the liturgy is revealed in his preface to the collected writings in 2008. Because he begins this collection with the liturgy. He writes, "When after some hesitation I decided to take on the project of an edition of my collected writings, it was clear to me that the order of priorities of the Council would apply, and that the volume with my writings on the liturgy would therefore have to be at the beginning. The liturgy of the Church has been the central reality of my life since childhood, and has also become the center of my theological endeavors in the theological school of teachers like Schmaus, Söngen, Pascher, and Gaudini." Thirdly, the canonical interpretation of Holy Scripture. The already mentioned wish list to the Christ child of the young boy Joseph in the house of the Ratzingers, with a request for the Volksschott, also reveals the attraction of the Holy Scriptures in the soul of the boy. His parents recognized and encouraged their son's early desire to know Christ in the sacred Scriptures. With the help of the Schott, young Joseph Ratzinger was able to overcome the hurdle of the Latin language, which at his age still denied many access and understanding. Perhaps these memories may be remembered when Pope Benedict said regarding, "I have been on an inward journey for a long time to this Jesus book, the first part of which I hereby present to the public." Pope Benedict identified the way that developed as canonical exegesis as the key to overcoming the narrowing. He defines, "The historical canonical method has done much, but has also caused many errors and was not able to really recognize the canonical method." Pope Benedict was aware that a fundamental dimension of the contribution of the Old Testament, and growth and leading leads to real theology. Fourthly, the ecclesiality of Christian existence. The unity of Scripture in Christ, so significant for fruitful exegesis, does not erase the existing distinction between the Old and New Testament, or the Old and New Covenant. Looking at this opens up a view of the nature and vocation of the Church. In the contribution Freimut and Gehorsam, Parrhesia and Obedience, he writes, "This could not ever happen completely because man is not completely good. The new covenant in Jesus Christ, however, is unconditional. In him the acceptance of man takes place through the incarnation of God himself. The Church as the new people of God is not conditional like Israel of old, but absolutely accepted by God. Her acceptance and non-rejection no longer stands on the ever-fluctuating conditionalis of human morality." In 1971, Joseph Ratzinger sums up the motives of his ecclesiasticism very personally. "Why am I still in the Church?" And he answers, "I am still in the Church because I believe that still and irrecoverably through us, behind our Church, lives his Church, and that I cannot stand with him in any other way than by standing with and in his Church. I am in the Church because I believe, despite everything, that it is profoundly not our Church, but precisely his Church." On this basis, Professor Ratzinger calmly unfolds the Christian's resulting way of life. The then Professor Ratzinger first sums it up in a negative. The fact that we are led to believe that we can become human without insisting on ourselves, without the patience of renunciation and the hardship of overcoming, that we are led to believe that we do not need the hardship of standing by what we have taken on and the patient suffering of the tension between the oath of man and his actual being. That is what essentially constitutes the crisis of our hour. I conclude, in the existence of oneself, in the patience of renunciation and the hardship of overcoming, in the hardship of standing by what is assumed, and in the patient suffering of the tension between the oath of man and his actual being human, is accomplished.
Vielen Dank, Prälat Moll. Ja, meine Damen und Herren, es gibt schon sehr viele Fragen. Ich will gleich am Anfang sagen,
Ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of questions,
alle Fragen aufgreifen
and I have to say
können,
that we
aber
surely cannot
die
take all of them,
wichtigsten werden wir
but the
hoffentlich
most
dann
important we will
auch hier
hopefully be able to
zur Sprache
tackle.
bringen. Ich weiß, dass auch Papst Benedikt zuschaut. Jedenfalls hat er das vorgehabt. Und ich denke, es ist, glaube ich,
I know that also Pope Benedict is watching us, and I think it is in the sense of the one or other here that I look over to Father Benedict, kind of, and say, Holy Father, Father Benedict, we wish you here from this symposium God's rich blessings for you who became blessing for so many as Benedictus. And I know that many spectators, viewers and listeners see it the same. So if you are agreed, we shall give an applause to Father Benedict from here as a greeting of blessing.
Wir sind nach wie vor dankbar, dass Sie da sind.
We're thankful that you're here.
Es gibt Fragen, aber die
So
erste
there's question,
Frage
but the
möchte
first question I'd like
vielleicht an den
to
Bischof Voderholzer
direct to
stellen,
Bishop Voderholzer,
weil mir bei dem Vortrag von
because
Pater Lang der Gedanke
during
kam, Lex
the
orandi, Lex
lecture of
credendi,
Father Lang, Lex orandi, Lex credendi,
Sie haben
the
ja auch
thought
den
came,
synodalen Weg
well,
angesprochen,
Your
den
Excellency, you have
sogenannten
mentioned this
synodalen
so-called
Weg.
synodal way.
Manche sagen ja ganz
Some
frech, es
say
sei der suizidale
It's the
Weg.
suicidal
Das
way,
wollen wir hier nur in Klammern
very
setzen.
harshly, but we want to put that in
Was
parentheses
ist
here.
eigentlich
So
über
what is
das Beten und die Kirche zu sagen,
to be
wenn
said about
heutzutage
prayer
so viele,
and the
ich
church
sag mal,
these
neue
days,
Formen
if there are so
der
many new
Liturgie
forms of
angedacht
liturgy
werden, des
thought out
Betens, der
and thought over,
Eucharistiefeier,
so
der
new forms of
Gemeindefeier
prayer,
angedacht
Eucharistic
werden, umgesetzt
celebration
werden. Man
in the
liest ja
congregation.
täglich von
We read
irgendwelchen
daily
neuen
about some
Formen.
new forms.
Sagt das was über
Does that
das
speak
Glaubensbild aus?
to
Oder
faith?
über die Kirche?
If the image of
Ist
faith
das
or
die
the image of the
Kirche
church,
Jesu
is that
Christi?
the church
Sie
of
haben ja
Jesus
den Bogen in
Christ?
die Aktualität geschlagen.
So you have
Und da wir unter den Zuhörerinnen und Zuschauern
taken
und
the light
Zuschauern
from
nicht
until
nur
today,
Theologen
and
haben,
as we
möchte ich
don't
mit
have only
dieser
theologians among our
etwas
spectators and
einfachen,
listeners,
vermeintlich
I'd like
einfachen
to
Frage
begin with
starten.
this seemingly easy question.
Vielen Dank für diese Frage.
Thank you very much for this
Die
question.
Überlegungen auch
The
in
considerations
mir wieder zum Schwingen bringen, die ich im Vorfeld der Vorbereitung meines
are recalled
Vortrages auch hatte.
within me now
Sie erinnern
that
sich,
I had when
ich
I
habe
prepared
ja
this
eine Reihe von
lecture.
Beispielen
You
genannt,
remember I had some
die einem
a
entgegengebracht
list of
werden, wenn es
examples
darum
that are
geht, dass in der
offered if
jüngsten
one speaks
Phase
about
der
the youngest
Kirchengeschichte
phase
die
of
Kirche
church
sich
history,
offenbar zu
that is that the church
vermeintlich
seems to allegedly
fast sprunghafter Lehrentwicklung
saltatory
fühlte.
development of
Das
doctrine.
Ganze ließe sich
And
vor dem Hintergrund einer
this could be
bestimmten Sichtweise
regarded
illustrieren durch
or
das, was in der
illustrated
Liturgie geschieht.
in front of a
Das
certain
ist
way
das
of
Gefährliche
dealing with
auch
liturgy.
daran,
And that is the dangerous
Denn
part in this, because liturgy is
der erste Erfahrungsraum
the
von
first
Kirche. Und wenn
room
hier der
of
Eindruck
experience of
entsteht,
church. And
man könne da
if,
machen, was man wolle,
if the impression is generated,
dann
you can do
wirkt
what you
sich
want,
das auch aus
this has
auf das
effects
Verständnis des Glaubens
on the
wieder.
understanding of
Deswegen
faith
ist das
as a whole.
Insistieren
So
auf
that is why the insisting on the
Kontinuität von,
continuity
altem Usus
of
und neuem
old usus
in
and
der
new
einen-
usus
in einem
in
römischen
the
Ritus
one
von
Roman
höchster
rite
Bedeutung, von höchster
is of
Brisanz.
utmost importance
Und deswegen muss
and
auch
actuality, and that is why
liturgischen
all
Wildwuchs, ich sag's jetzt
liturgical
einmal so,
wild grow, I'm saying that a bit
mit Entschiedenheit auch
boldly,
begegnet werden.
has to be counted decisively.
Liturgie
The
ist
liturgy is
Ausdruck, ist Norm, wir haben es
expression,
vorhin von Pater
norm,
Lang auch
we have
gehört,
heard this from Father Lang,
des Glaubens, und
is expression of the
man
faith,
müsste sich
and one would have
auf alles,
to
was in einem offiziellen Gebet der Kirche gesagt,
one would have to restrict
formuliert,
oneself
gebetet
in
wird, auch
the public
als
prayer of the
Glaubensquelle
church,
berufen können.
and would have to
Das ist ja auch der
be
Grund,
able
dass
to
die
refer to the
liturgische
faith
Bücher
in every
approbiert
prayer
werden müssen.
printed, and that's
Deswegen
why
nicht
liturgical
einfach
books have to be
jeder und jede
have to get
als
recognition,
Liturger,
approbation,
als Liturgin,
and that's why not everybody can
das auch
just
mit
stand
eigenen
up as
Texten im Namen der Kirche
liturgical
sprechen und beten
actor
kann,
with own texts in the
sondern die
name of the
Liturgie
church.
ist etwas,
No, on the other hand,
Vorgegebenes, in das
no,
wir
furthermore, the liturgy is something given
Ich habe jetzt,
in that we enter.
weder eine schnelle Lösung oder
I don't have a
ein
quick
Rezept,
solution
wie man
or
hier
a
wieder für
recipe
Klarheit sorgen
or
könnte. Ich kann nur,
possibility how
von
to
Herzen darum
provide
bitten,
clarity,
alle,
but I
die
can
mit
only
dem
ask you
Dienst
all
auch
from all of my
des
heart, all
Vorstehens
you
der
who
Liturgie
are
betraut sind,
in who is confided the position
große
of
Ehrfurcht
leading liturgy,
und
to lead them in
achtsam
high
mit dem
respect
umzugehen, was
and
ihnen
carefully
anvertraut ist,
handle that carefully what has been confided
auch
to
im
you.
Hinblick
Also in
auf
regard
den Schutz und auf das
to the
Recht der
protection
einfachen
and the
Gläubigen,
right of the
in der
simple
Liturgie nicht durch
faithful,
irgendwelche persönlichen Meinungen
the right not to be
manipuliert zu werden,
manipulated by
sondern
personal
durch die
opinions or
Liturgie und den
preferences,
großen Atem
but
der
sense the
Überlieferung der
great
Kirche und ihres Glaubens
breath
hineingenommen zu werden.
of the liturgy of the church.
Das wäre nämlich auch die Frage,
So that would be the question some
bewegt.
spectators
Ist
are
das noch
moved
meine
by.
Kirche?
Is this still my church?
Grenze?
And where's the limit?
Liturgie.
When liturgy,
Kardinal Koch hat
well, I mean,
deutlich gemacht,
Cardinal
dass
Koch has
Hierarchie, also die
made
Kirche
clear
auch
that
gegliedert,
hierarchy,
dass
that
das nicht
the
heilige
church
Macht oder heilige
in
Gewalt bedeutet,
hierarchy
sondern
is
heiliger
not
Ursprung.
holy power,
Das heißt,
but holy origin, sacred origin.
Form
So the
für
form
die Reform, die
for the
Urform
reform,
ist
the
Jesus Christus
origin is
selbst.
Jesus Christ
Und die
himself.
Eucharistie
And
ist
the Eucharist
der Kern der
is
Kirche. Wenn
the core
ich da die Frage anschließen
of
darf,
the
ich glaube, hier gibt
church.
es nicht
And if
viele,
I
die
may
Sie darum beneiden, dass Sie beim
add the
suizidalen
question,
Weg
I
dabei sein
think
müssen.
there's not many who envy you being
wenn ich die
part of the
Frage
suicidal way.
anschließen
So
darf.
if I may add the
Weiß
question,
man dort, was
does one
Liturgie
know
ist?
there what is liturgy?
Ich bitte darum, das jetzt nicht definitiv
I'd
beantworten zu müssen.
like
Ich
to
kann es
ask
auch
you
nicht sagen, weil
to
natürlich
relieve me
die
from answering this
Bandbreite derer, die
definitively, and I can't
synodalen Weg teilnehmen, natürlich
can't
auch
pay a judgment to those
sehr
who participate in the synodal
groß
way.
ist.
It's a big panorama of people.
Jedenfalls, ich sehe es
Anyhow,
als meine
I would see it as my
Verantwortung, als
responsibility as a bishop
Bischof für ein gesundes Respektieren liturgischer
to
Ordnung
take care for it
einzutreten
and
und auch
take a stand for a
gegebenenfalls
healthy,
einzuschreiten, wenn mir
respectful handling of liturgy, and to
berichtet wird,
intervene if I'm
das nicht der Fall
reported
ist. Und man muss natürlich
that this
sehen,
is not the case.
es gibt
And one has
eine
also to
ungute
see that there is a
Machtausübung durch eigenmächtige Liturgen und
self-empowerment of self-nominated liturgists,
es sind
which
oft
is
genau
not good,
dieselben, die
and
dann
it's often
denen,
always
die
the
sich in der
same
Liturgie an die Ordnung halten,
that keep the order.
Machtbewusstsein und Klerikalismus vorwerfen. Es ist oft genau umgekehrt.
That it's almost the same liturgists
Klare
that then
Antwort.
reproach those
Ja.
who keep the tradition of just being power
Ein
hungry.
Hörer aus dem Bistum Münster.
A listener from the Diocese of Münster
Kommen
asks,
die Fragen an die anderen. Zunächst einmal sagt er,
first of
vielen Dank
all,
an Bischof
thank
Voderholzer
you
für
very
seine
much for Bishop
deutlichen
Voderholzer for
Worte,
his clear
die
words
viel Licht spenden.
that radiate light. You have mentioned the synodal way, and that already the starting point was wrongly chosen, because they anchored in their understanding of liberty. But if already the starting point is wrong, is there a possibility to come to correct solutions at the end? Asked the spectator of Münster. What is your opinion? How will this finish? And already St. Thomas said, when the beginning is wrong, everything is wrong. So your prognosis, your prophetic prognosis. First of all, I'd like to point out that already in August 2019, together with Cardinal Welki, I proposed an alternative statute and also alternative themes for the fora of the synodal way. I proposed it, but sadly in the Bishops' Conference, the Plenary Assembly, we didn't get a majority, a sufficient majority for this. We had hoped that the synodal way, which we have not wanted to refute, because we have to respect Pope Francis's wishes, so we wanted to preserve that and set the right starting point, and we explicitly wanted to take the letter of the Holy Father to the Pilgrim Church in Germany, the Pilgrim people in Germany. We wanted to take this seriously and have this become part of the synodal way and have the primacy in new evangelization and respect the unity of the Church. But this has not been successful. In this we have not been successful, which I greatly regret. And I'm more and more of the opinion that it would have been better if we had followed this proposal. And I can only hope that once later on we will come back to this proposal, because if not, I'll be very, very worried for the unity of the Church in Germany among themselves. You have to see that it's until parish level, until family level, there are dissenses among Catholics. The parishes and dioceses are concerned, and this has to be this has to be healed, and not on the basis of rotten compromises or stinky compromises, but on the basis of the common faith. And perhaps the integration of the German synodal way in the international Roman synodal path is a possible solution, a possible way. I very much hope so. But it will take much more struggle and fighting, and I hope for much support also from the Holy City of Rome. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. You may applaud, of course.
An Prelate Graulich fragt ein Hörer aus dem
There's a question for Prelate Graulich from the Diocese of Erfurt. The canon law as lex libertatis shall protect the faith of the simple, a nice image, but what do we do if we don't, if it is not applied, or if a bishop is in general not respected, and what does one do is if one wants to be obedient to the bishop? Well, this is a very serious problem, that the bishops do not apply the law, or do not apply the law in the way it is written, or just partially apply it. So at the moment the canon law is applied where it regards abuse, but already when abuse is enacted, it will be applied only to those who have a accommodated opinion. The legislative authority is the Pope. He can only invite that one respects the law. He then acts and deposes bishops if it's not respected. So we have in the last years seen some penal action against bishops who have acted wrongly regarding abuse. We had a few bishops that had been deposed because they made errors in financial administration, not corresponding to canon law, but there is lacking a legal culture in the church where it would be normal to apply the law. So if I see that the poor bishop of Chur, who enacts according to the law regarding the case of a woman who committed liturgical abuse, and when one could say, well, let's be happy that a bishop applies the law, no, he is facing furied opposition. So we have to try to work on the legal culture in the church, and it is the bishops the first who have to contribute to this. Thank you very much. From Rottenburg, Stuttgart, the question, why does one let liberalist theologians that Bishop Voderholzer characterized as not more tenable, why do we allow them to educate our theological offspring? How shall one exit from the diabolical circle in that way? Who would like to answer this? Father Lang?
Gut, von meiner Perspektive
Well,
aus kann ich
from my perspective speaking,
viel dazu sagen.
I cannot say
Ein
much to
grundsätzliches
this.
Problem
A fundamental
heutzutage
problem
scheint mir
in
zu
these
sein,
days seems
dass
to
die
be
kirchlichen
that
Rechtsmittel,
the
die zur Verfügung
ecclesiastic
stehen,
means, like lawful means,
zu korrigieren
to
oder
correct theologians or maybe
irgendwelche Strafmaßnahmen
enact penal measures
ihnen aufzulegen,
in their regard
oft kontraproduktiv
are
sind.
counterproductive.
Denn
Because
solche Zensuren
Because
fallen
such
oft auf die
censor
Kirche selbst
measures
zurück und
fall back on the church
schaffen eine
and
noch viel
create
größere
a
Öffentlichkeit
even
für
greater
die gewagten Thesen,
publicity
die
for
ein
the
Theologe, eine Theologin vertritt. Das heißt,
hazardous
es ist sehr
thesis such a
schwierig,
theologian
scheint mir hier für
propagates. So for me,
Kirche,
it
also
seems to be
rechtlich,
very difficult to
bindend
ask the church
zu
to
antworten.
act in a legally binding way.
Mir scheint, dass das auch Kardinal Ratzinger als
And I think
perfekter
also Cardinal Ratzinger, as a
Glaubenskommunikationsvertrag
prefect
gesehen
of
hat
the
und
Congregation
dem
for the Doctrine of Faith, has
entgegenwirken
seen that, and he
wollte,
wanted to
positiv lehrte,
set
also
other effects, counter effects, while learning, teaching positively. He wanted to show the right way in such situations, in such discussions.
Man hat das ja etwa
Because-
in der Sache von Hans Küng gesehen.
And for example, we
Man
saw that in the
schafft
case
im
of
Grunde
Hans
genommen
Küng. You
eine
create
Celebrity,
a celebrity
was von der Sache vielleicht
that maybe
einerseits
regarding
kontraproduktiv ist und auch
the issue
im
is
Grunde genommen nicht
counterproductive and not worth it.
Vielen Dank, Prelate
Thank you very
Moll.
much. Prelate Moll,
Ich
you know,
Erfahrung in der Glaubenskongregation
well, I
doch so
can
viel sagen,
say
dass ich die
a bit
Stellungnahme
from
von
the
Pater
experience
Lang
within
nicht
the
teile.
Congregation for the
Kardinal
Doctrine of Faith,
Ratzinger hat, wenn
that I
immer
do not
Missbräuche
agree
in
to the
den
statement
Diözesen
of Father
geschehen
Lang.
sind,
Whenever there was
liturgische
liturgical
Missbräuche,
abuse in the
ökumenische
dioceses, ecumenical
immer
abuses,
unseren Mitarbeitern gesagt,
he always told
Inquietare Vescovi.
our members, Inquietare Vescovi,
Doch nicht.
say, just worry
Inquietare
the
Vescovi,
bishops.
die Bischöfe beunruhigen.
Please worry the bishops.
Sodass wir dann
So that
Briefe
we
schreiben
then
mussten an
had
die
to
Bischöfe
write
und
letters to the
sagen,
bishops and say,
das und das ist
this and this
vorgefallen in
has
Ihrem
happened
Bistum.
in
Sie
your
wissen, im
diocese, you
Kodex
know
steht
in the
das und
code
das,
of
im
canon
Konzil
law is
steht
this
das
and
und
that,
das.
and in the
Wollen
council
Sie so
documents is
freundlich
this and
sein,
that.
die Missstände
Would you please be
abzustellen?
so kind
Das
to
war
set
eine
an end, to put an end to
durchgängige
those
Linie von
abuses?
Kardinal
That was a general line of
Ratzinger,
Cardinal
Vescovi.
Ratzinger, Inquietare Vescovi,
Okay, dann
worry
reichen wir
the
die Frage mal an den
bishops.
Bischof hier auf dem Podium
So
weiter.
then we
Wir wissen
put
ja,
this question to the bishop on this
Sie haben
podium.
gedacht, das
Oh,
geht
you
an Ihnen
thought
vorbei, ne?
it will not touch
Also,
you.
wir wissen ja,
So
dass
we
die
know
Bischöfe
that the bishops
bei ihrer Weihe unter
at their
anderem
ordination,
versprechen,
among others at the
dass sie die
consecration,
Lehre der Kirche,
promise
die
that
gesicherte
they
Lehre der Kirche
will the
treu
secured
verkünden
teaching
werden.
of the church,
Und
they
wenn
will
ich das richtig in Erinnerung habe,
proclaim
haben
it
auch die
faithfully.
Bischöfe,
And if
ich
I'm
glaube, dazu gehören
recalling
dann auch
that
die deutschen
correctly,
Bischöfe,
all the bishops, also the German
Aufgabe,
bishops, have
das
the task
Glaubensvolk im klaren
to
Glauben zu
teach
stärken.
and strengthen the people of God in the faith. So I built you a small bridge.
Wir können natürlich auch noch mal darüber sprechen,
Or we
weil
also
Vater
could
Lang davon gesprochen hat,
talk
dass
about,
eben, oder auch
because Father Lang alluded to it, and
dass
Father
wir eine
Graulich,
Stimmung haben,
that we have
die natürlich auch von den Medien mitbestimmt
an
wird.
attitude
Welche
at the
Bedeutung haben
moment
die
that is
Medien
also
heute
determined by the
in der
media.
Kirche?
What
Und wie viele
is
Medien
the
führen
role and
dazu,
importance of the media
in ihrer Art und Weise,
today,
wie sie
and
massiv
how do they
auftreten, anders als zum Beispiel hier die
lead
Medien, die einen Dienst verrichten,
to a
dass
certain
viele Bischöfe auch geradezu ängstlich sind. Ich habe von einem
attitude
Bischof
and
mal
leads to that bishops
erfahren,
are
dass er gesagt hat, ich
rightly
äußere mich nicht, ich habe einfach Angst.
anxious. And the bishop has said, I will
Nun
not
ist das
speak
vielleicht
up,
nicht
I'm
die erste
simply afraid.
Jobbeschreibung für den Bischof.
Well, this is not, firstly, not the
Angst
first,
zu
not the
haben,
best
aber
job
es
description
ist
for a
ein
bishop, but
Faktum.
it is a fact.
Ich hätte mich schon gemeldet in dieser Frage.
I have
Zunächst einmal
responded
kann ich nur sagen, die Frage ist
of my
vollkommen
own will.
berechtigt. Sie
So
kommt aus
first of
dem
all, the question is completely
Bistum
justified.
Rottenburg-Stuttgart.
It's
Es ist
coming
schon
from the
angeschnitten worden.
Diocese Rottenburg-Stuttgart, and we have already
Die Theologische Fakultät
alluded to
Tübingen,
the fact of the
das
Theological
zu
Faculty of
Rottenburg-Stuttgart
Tübingen,
gehört,
which belongs to
hat
Rottenburg-Stuttgart,
den vielleicht
has
letzten
the
großen
perhaps last
Prozess oder das
big
letzte große
process or the
Verfahren
last big
erlebt, die Causa Küng, die
proceedings, the Causa Küng.
der damalige Erzbischof von München und Freising ja auch
At that time,
ziemlich
Archbishop of München and Freising
mitgetragen hat.
was prominently
Und wir
supporting the
wissen
cause,
alle,
and we
mit
all
welchem
know with
Erfolg,
which
das Ganze
success this
letztlich
then
ausgegangen
at the end
ist.
resulted.
Hans
Hans
sozusagen
Küng
als
was
Held und als Märtyrer aus der Situation
regarded
hervorgegangen.
as a hero and a
Und
martyr
seine
from that situation
Berühmtheit
on,
ist nicht
and his
gesteigert
celebrity
worden,
was
seine
just
Celebrity, wie wir vorhin
augmented,
gehört
was
haben.
just
Das darf natürlich kein Grund sein,
heightened.
dass
Well, this
das
should
kirchliche
not be a
Lehramt
ground,
klar
a
Position
reason
bezieht und
that
das, was nicht,
magisterium should not take a
in
position
benannt bei Hans
and not
Küng,
name what is
und
not
ist also gerade
okay.
noch mit der
Well, with,
wirklich
in the case of Hans Küng, we also had the very tactically
sich selber zu
intelligent
stilisieren
way
zu tun, dass
of
nämlich
characterizing
seine
himself
christologischen Irrlehren
as a
versteckt hat und sich als derjenige
he presented
stilisiert hat,
himself
der jetzt
as
die
that person that
Kirchenstrukturen
would
kritisiert und die
criticize
Kirchenkritik ist ja
structure
immer
of
wieder
church and
Also man
not
hat hier natürlich mit
and
vielen
hid that he
Mächten zu
had
kämpfen,
Christological
auch mit einer
errors.
bestimmten,
So we
nicht
have to fight
informierten
against a lot of
rein
forces
politisch und äußerlich
and also
denkenden
with a
medialen
politically thinking and not
Also die Sache
informed
ist nicht einfach. Ich rede
public
mittlerweile aus
audience.
10-jähriger
So
Erfahrung. Ich habe
the,
als Bischof
the issue is not
ein
easy.
großes
I'm
Problem
talking from 10 years
der
of
Verweigerung
experience as a
des
bishop,
Nichtobstats
and I have
in
as
Bezug
only
auf,
last
die
resort
staatlichen
the
Fakultäten.
to negate, to deny the nihil
Ich habe
obstat,
vielleicht
that
den
is the
Vorteil,
right
dass
to
ich
teach
als
at
ehemaliger Professor zumindest
ecclesiastical
auf
faculties,
Augenhöhe reden
and
kann.
I have the advantage that as a
Hier
former
wird
professor I can speak on eyes height,
alles
so
Mögliche, davor gaukeln
I'm
lassen,
respected
oder
and do
so,
not
die
have experience and do not have to be
weiß darum,
reproached,
wie
I
man
would ignorance.
jemanden,
And I know how
einen bestimmten
to
Kandidatin, einen bestimmten Kandidaten, dem man einfach aufgrund der
ask a candidate,
Kirchlichkeit
a
oder
female
der
or male
Lehrausrichtung
candidate
nicht
that
mag,
one does
wegen angeblicher
dislike,
Unwissenschaftlichkeit versucht auszuloten und so weiter.
how one can try
Das, was ich mir schon lange nicht
make
mehr vormache.
not
Und trotzdem
called
ist es
such a
nicht
candidate.
einfach für einen
And I know all
kirchlichen
these
Geist
tricks,
in
but
einer
still it's not easy for an ecclesiastic
zu
spirit
sorgen. Und dann möchte ich darauf
to
hinweisen,
take
dass wir
care and
gegenwärtig
provide
ja in
an
Köln
ecclesiastic
erleben den Versuch
faculty.
eines
And I have to
Bischofs,
say that we
eine
at Cologne see
theologische
now
eine Hochschule
the
mit einer
tentative
theologischen
of
Fakultät,
a bishop that has a
aufzubauen, an einer
has a
Ordenshochschultradition
own
anzuknüpfen.
faculty, ecclesiastical faculty at a public university, and he tries to render justice to his responsibility to have a real ecclesiastic spirit at a faculty. So he tries to build up another faculty that is really ecclesiastic, and we see with what hate and spite this is reacted upon. This is reality that we see us in, but this shall not hinder us as bishops to be active. But our possibilities are very restricted. That is a side effect of the theological faculties at state universities. It's a situation that is not in many years, that's in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland,
in Regionen der Welt
other regions of the world, the theological education, the formation of the priests, in other countries it is within church responsibility, and some problems are then not given in that way. Nonetheless, it is true the theological faculties are the origin of a lot of what is now regarded as mainstream. And I can only reiterate here what you have said, Father Graulich. We as bishops have the responsibility to protect the simple faith of the faithful against the hybris, against the arrogance of a certain type of self-sufficient theology. Just because remember the KHKT, the Kölner University of Catholic Theology, many viewers, listeners will ask, so we have the ecclesiastic competence at this table. Is it possible that a secular government, state government, can restrict and determine where priests can be educated? Well, it's the problem of the Concordat as a international public treaty. It's above canon law, and one has to enter into dialogue. And maybe it needs good signals from Rome, Your Eminence. We hand the plea to you, Your Eminence, that we need good theologians for Catholic faculties. There's another question from Regensburg. How can a Christian that wants to be faithful and show fidelity to the Church, how can he or she recognize if a certain teaching does correspond to the continuous teaching of the Church? Very easy question. I trust, and I've seen many examples of it, I trust that there is a sensus ecclesiae, a feeling for the Church with simple faithful, and they very well recognize if something is true to Scripture, true to the teaching of the Church. If a preacher is talking out of a deep relationship with Christ and love to Christ, tries to explain the Scriptures, and he shows a passion for that, a passion for taking into his relationship to Christ, or whether this is just all with a distance, it's done out of the distance to ecclesiastical teaching and magisterium, if church politics is on the forefront and not the exegesis of the sacred scriptures or other topics that can have their place in the homily, for example, the collect or the psalms, especially the normal civil faithful sense this, but a full-fledged criteriology one cannot put here. So there is also a broad of possibilities and preferences. Also, Pope Benedict always says the creativity in liturgy shall be lived in the homily and not within the prayers or other aspects of the liturgy. Creativity in the sense of an update or a rejuvenation of what is the relationship to Jesus Christ, but not a church politic position. There's another question, and because you have mentioned the synodal way, you're in the focus of the interest, but I invite all the others also to pronounce themselves regarding this. Is there a magisterial sentence regarding to the development of dogma that would be so that it would be possible to react mandatorily, decisively
das ist das, was ich versucht
on
habe.
what
Also
the
auf der Basis
well, that's
des
what I
Zweiten
tried to say on the basis of the
Vatikanischen
Second Vatican Council
und im Lichte
and in the light
bedeutender Theoretiker
of
einer
important
Möglichkeit
theologians,
eines
theoretical
Fortschritts,
thinkers, the possibility
hier Kriterien zu
to
entwickeln.
outline a possibility of
Und die
process.
müssen im Einzelfall dann eben angewendet
And this
werden.
has
Und
to
ich
be
glaube, ich habe keinen
applied
Zweifel daran
in this
gelassen,
special case.
dass die
But I think I haven't
Anwendung vor
left
allem
any
der
doubts
Newmanschen
that,
Kriterien auf das, was uns jetzt hier
especially the
angeboten wird,
application of the
nicht dazu führt,
criteria
dass man das als
Newman
legitime Lehrentwicklung
proposed
anerkennen
shall
kann, sondern von einer Korruption sprechen muss.
cannot but lead
passt
to
ja
the
gleich die
assumption
nächste
that
Frage aus Baden-Württemberg an Sie
we're
dazu.
seeing us in front of a
Warum wäre es so
corruption.
schlimm, wenn sich die
The
Lehre
question of
verändert?
Rottenburg is, why would it be
Warum würde sich
so
dann auch die
terrible
kirchliche
if
Identität ändern? Ich ändere doch im Laufe meines
magisterium
Lebens auch meine
would
Ansichten,
change,
bleibe
the church
eigentlich
would
derselbe.
change, of course, but I myself
Ja,
change
das ist
opinions during the course of
die
myself
Aussage,
and
die man schon
develop.
bei Newman findet, dass man
Well,
sagt,
that's
also
the
nur wer sich wandelt, bleibt sich
statement
treu.
we find also at
Das
Newman,
stimmt
only
in
who
gewisser
changes
Weise,
stays
aber man
faithful
muss
to
eben
himself.
auch schauen,
That's true in a
welche-
certain sense, but you have also
Um welche Fälle
to
handelt es sich jetzt?
look more closely what
Es
are
ist
the
ja eine-
cases. So
Einem Wandel in Bezug auf
a
den
change
Ausdruck,
regarding the expression
auch einer Inkulturation
and
nicht
regarding the
widersprochen worden.
inculturation
Aber
is not denied per
ein
se,
kontradiktorischer Widerspruch
but
zum
a
Beispiel, und den
contradictory
haben wir in einigen Fällen, die uns vorgeschlagen wurden,
statement,
tatsächlich
and we
gegeben,
have that in some
kann
cases that have
nicht,
been
als
proposed to us. So a real contradiction cannot be regarded as being faithful to oneself. To oneself.
Es gibt auch lebensgeschichtliche
There are,
gewaltige
of course,
Brüche,
in the course of biographies,
aber
ruptures,
die Kirche als ein
but the church
Organismus
as an organism
darf solche Brüche, jedenfalls ist das die tiefe
can
Überzeugung,
and shall
so
such
nicht
ruptures
akzeptieren,
not
weil sie sich nicht
accept,
selber gegeben hat und
because
weil sie es
she
von
is
einem
not given herself, but
Ursprungsereignis
she
her
is
lebt,
living from
dem sie
an
treu
original
bleiben muss,
event,
wenn sie
and she
Kirche
has to
bleiben
stay faithful to this original event
Jetzt gönne
if
ich
she
Ihnen
wants
mal
to
eine
stay the
kleine
church.
Pause, Herr Bischof, weil jetzt Fragen
Your Excellency, I give you a short pause because now there's questions for Father Moll, Graulich and Lang. So to Prelate
Kann es so
Moll,
etwas wie eine
Can there be-
zu Wort werden zwischendurch, also, das klar ist.
you can intervene, of course.
Kann es so etwas
Can
wie
there
eine
be something
unveränderliche
like
Lehre der
an
Kirche heute noch geben, wo
unchangeable
sich täglich
doctrine of the
alles Mögliche
church
ändert, was
where
gestern
daily
noch galt?
everything
Prelate Moll
changes
sprach
what
von der
yesterday
Liturgie
was still
Ratzingers
valid?
Kindheit, aber
Prelate
steht
Moll
nicht gerade
spoke
die
of the Ratzinger
als Beispiel
liturgy
für
of childhood, but isn't that
Diskontinuität,
exactly
zumal sie
an
heute
example of
gerade
discontinuity,
verboten wird?
especially because it's now in the process of being forbidden?
Jesus Christus ist derselbe.
Jesus Christ
gestern,
is the
heute
same
und in
yesterday, today,
Ewigkeit.
and in eternity.
Das sagt der Hebräerbrief
That is
ganz
what the
klar.
letter to the Hebrews says
Christus
very
ist
clearly.
derselbe,
Christ
gestern,
is the same
heute
yesterday,
und in
today,
Ewigkeit.
and in eternity, for all
Das
times.
Christusbild, das die
The
Kirche
image of
vermittelt,
Christ that the
kann
church
nicht
tries to
geändert
convey
werden.
cannot be changed.
Aber das Christusbild
But
zeigt
the
sich in der
image of
Liturgie.
Christ is shown in the
Die
liturgy.
äußeren Formen können
The
wechseln.
external forms
Wir
can
haben 5
change. We
verschiedene
have
Formen des
5
des
different
Bußaktes.
forms
Wir
of
haben
the
eine ganze heilige
act of
Schrift,
penitence.
die wir
We have the
lesen
whole,
können.
the sacred
Jeder
scriptures
kann
we
die
can
Schrift
read.
auslegen,
Everybody
wie der Predigt,
can,
der Priester und Diakon ist.
Can
Es gibt 10
interpret the
Hochgebete.
sacred scripts of the
Diese
priest and
sind alle
diacon.
dem
There's
Wandel
10
unterworfen. Aber
Eucharistic
innerhalb
prayers.
dieses
So there is a
Wandels
lot of
gibt
change,
es
but
eine
within this
Kontinuität
change,
und auch
there's a
eine
continuity
Unveränderlichkeit, nämlich
and an
Gott
immutability.
zu ehren,
That is,
Gott zu
give honor
preisen,
to God, give
Gott
praise to
nahe
God,
zu sein, im
be near to
Sakrament,
God in the
sodass es
sacrament.
schon
So this is
Unveränderlichkeit
really
gibt in den Veränderlichkeiten
unchangeable,
des Alltags.
immutable within the daily
Herr Prelate, ich möchte
changes.
da nochmal im Sinne derjenigen, die solche Fragen stellen, nachbohren.
Reverend Prelate, I'd like to
glaube, da war auch die
continue
Frage drin
a bit
enthalten,
more
wie kann
on that
es sein,
question,
dass
insist a
eine
bit more on this
Liturgie,
question. So how can it be that a
über
liturgy that
Jahrhunderte
had
galt in der
been
Kirche heute quasi verboten
in the
wird
church for
und nicht
hundreds
mehr
of years
gefeiert
is
wird?
now forbidden
die
suddenly in the
überlieferte
church and shall
Liturgie.
not be
Im
celebrated
Gegensatz
anymore.
zur
That is the
Liturgie, die Liturgiereform nach dem
liturgy,
Zweiten Vatikanischen Konzil uns gegeben
the
hat.
extraordinary and the liturgy that
Frage
the former
schlummerte
form
ja
and
auch
the
in dem,
form of
was
today after the Second
derjenige
Vatican
hier zum Ausdruck
Council.
gebracht hat, die Person. Warum ist denn
So
damals,
why,
als Joseph Ratzinger
at that time when Joseph Ratzinger was a child, there wasn't this post-conciliar liturgy, but there was only the traditional liturgy. And a lot of people have the impression that this is now not wanted, is forbidden.
Das ist
even more as
zumal ja Benedikt XVI.
Benedict XVI
seinem Engagement
had with his commitment 2007
dafür sorgen wollte, dass beide Formen der
taken
Liturgie,
care
Sie haben es auch angedeutet, beide Formen der Liturgie
that both forms of the
versöhnt
liturgy
sein sollen
would
und
be
sich nicht
reconciled
gegenseitig
and
ausschließen dürfen.
not exclude themselves mutually.
Papst Benedikt XVI.
Pope Benedict
sagte
XVI
ja in Summorum
says in
Pontificum,
Summorum Pontificum
dass es beide
that
Wegen
both
geben
rights shall
soll,
be
die aber
in
aufeinander
existence,
bezogen
but
sein
they have to
sollten.
be related
Und
to each
keiner
other,
sollte dem anderen
referring to
die
each other,
Katholizität
and no
absprechen.
one should deny Catholicity
Franziskus
the other.
hat diese
Pope
Entwicklung
Francis
gesehen,
saw this
und hat
development
gesagt,
and said,
die Menschen, die die tridentische
Those
Liturgie
who
feiern,
celebrate the
sagen,
Tridentine liturgy
wir
say,
feiern noch die gültige
we
Liturgie,
find the
was das
valid
andere ist, die
liturgy,
feiern
and what
nicht
the
mehr die
other
gültige.
is, the others don't
Sodass
celebrate the
Kardinal
valid
Kasper
liturgy.
meinte,
So even
dass
Cardinal
es hier
Kasper
zu
had to
einer
say this
gegensätzlichen
has
Bewegung kommt, nicht eben zu einer Versöhnung
been developing
zwischen
within
beiden
in a
Riten,
contrary
sondern
stream,
zu einem
not a conciliation
Antagonismus,
but an
dass
antagonism.
der alte Ritus
So the
meint,
old
er
rite
sei der
thinks
einzig
it would be
gültige.
the only
Und der
valid
neue
one,
Ritus
and the
sei
new
eine
rite
Verwässerung.
would be a
Und
watering
deshalb hat
down. And that's
Franziskus
why
gesagt,
Pope Francis said the old rite can be celebrated, but not in the parish churches, because in the parish churches is the new rite to be celebrated. So that would result in confusion. If in a parish church you would have both old and new rites. So that's why Francis said the old rite should be in sanctuaries or in rectorate churches. And from there, one gets the impression that, well, if it is not valid for Germany, as a lot of say, but for France and other countries, that those two liturgies deter themselves and that they hurt themselves, and they shouldn't hurt themselves because they should derive, from the same one fundament. It's not easy to be understood, but I say Francis has decided that the old Mass shall be celebrated in not parish churches, also in the Archdiocese of Cologne, but the new liturgy under Paul VI comes to the parish churches so they don't dispute and conflict.
Sie haben selber angedeutet, das ist für viele schwer zu verstehen oder schwierig
You
zu
alluded to the
verstehen.
fact that it's difficult to understand.
Eine Frage, ein Zuhörer
Another
stellt eine Frage
question
an Prelate Graulich.
asked a
Er
question
hatte
to Prelate
bekräftigt, dass
Graulich.
die Texte nicht
The
doppeldeutig
texts
sein
are
sollen.
not
Geht das noch im
ambiguous.
21.
Is that
Jahrhundert?
possible in
Gibt es
21st
nicht
century?
immer unzählige
Aren't there
Interpretationen, die auch
innumerable
für Weiterentwicklung
interpretations
stehen
that
können?
stand also for further development?
Ja, die Texte werden so
Well, the
formuliert,
texts are formulated in a
dass sie
way
keine
that
Zweideutigkeiten
they
haben.
are not
Und
ambiguous,
sollten sie durch
and
gesellschaftliche
should
Entwicklungen
they
Zweideutigkeiten
become ambiguous through societal
empfangen,
developments,
sozusagen, müssen sie geändert werden.
they have to be
Ich gebe ein ganz
changed.
konkretes
I'll give a
Beispiel.
concrete
Im Eherecht
example.
steht es
In
drin,
marriage
eine
law there is
persona
said
jura habeles.
a persona jura habeles, a lawful,
kann die
capable
Ehe
person can contract marriage.
Das könnte heute missverstanden
Well, this
werden.
could be misunderstood
Deshalb müssen wir bei einer
today,
nächsten
so
Überarbeitung des
that's why in a
Eherechts
next
Mann und Frau, die rechtlich nicht
revision
behindert sind,
we have to
können die
write
Ehe
man
eingehen.
and woman who
Also
aren't
es gibt
rightly
Zweideutigkeiten,
who aren't
wenn sie
hindered
im
by the
Begriff
law.
sind, sind sie lange
So
geklärt. Dafür gab es die Phase
if
der
there's
authentischen
a concept
Interpretation,
they're long cleared.
die diese
So
Zweifel
there was the
klärt.
phase of interpretation,
Aber eigentlich
but
die Gesetzestexte,
the
zumindest soweit sie
legal
unser
texts,
Dikasterium
as
zu
far as
verantworten
our
hat,
dicastery has to take
bemühen sich um eine
responsibility for them,
eindeutige
they
Sprache.
try to
Deshalb
have a
wurde zum
very
Beispiel
unambiguous
der
language.
Begriff einer
That's why
vulnerablen Person nicht
the
in das neue Strafrecht
word of a
aufgenommen
vulnerable
weil dieser
person
Begriff nicht
has not been
definiert
taken up in the new penal
also
law,
benutzt schon
as the notion
ja.
wasn't to be defined, a
Ein Zuhörer
vulnerable
aus
person.
Österreich fragt Pater Lang,
Spectre
wie
of
konnte es nach
Austria
Ihrer
asked
Meinung
Father Lang,
kommen, dass
how
die
could it come that the
Liturgiereform
liturgy, the reform of the
heiligen
liturgy
Papstes Paul
of
VI.
the
bis
Holy
heute
Pope Paul
von
VI
vielen als Bruch und
is
nicht als
still
kontinuierliche Entwicklung gesehen wird?
regarded as a
Was
rupture and not
bedeutet
as a
das für die
continuous development? What does that mean for
der Lehre?
continuity of
noch
the
etwas
magisterium?
hinzufügen,
And I'd like
das
to add
Kirchenbild
myself,
vielleicht.
and also for the image of the church.
Nun, das lag sicher auch daran, dass diese Liturgiereform in die 60er Jahre fiel, die 1960er
Well,
Jahre.
that the reform was in the 1960s. In the time of change, of revolutionary epoch, and the real liturgy reform was characterized by this forms. A dynamic has ensued that the Council Fathers surely didn't foresee or want like that. Sacrosanctum Concilium was the first conciliar constitution, as the question was not regarded as controversial, differently from the question regarding Revelation or the Church. So there was a consensus, and the text was almost unanimously adopted. And the situation was that the reform of the liturgy very quickly was influenced by this revolutionary currents, and that contributed considerably to that problematic. Well, now it has happened. It's a fact. And we have to see how one can connect those dots again, these threads. Pope Benedict has tried to do this, giving a target perspective somehow with Summorum Pontificum. But, no, in fact, a mutual enrichment and influencing one from to the other, that should have led to a unification, harmonization of the right, but not in near future, but perhaps in 100 years. But the current situation is very unclear. And I think this contributes to, in questions of faith and moral and mysterium, the way how we give glory to God says a lot about how we believe and how we act out this faith in our life. And that's why the question for continuity and organic unfolding seems so much important for me. And you can't consider this isolated. Prelate Moll mentioned the quotation of Pope Benedict that only within the renewals and the changes of the 20th century it became clear how important liturgy is for the image of God and the perception of God. Maybe now we're a bit wiser than those in the 1960s, and this experience can help us to come to an organic development. Solange you're the expert of the liturgy, so what does that mean concretely? Can one say, regarding what you just said now, that also Pope Benedict had the wish to make conciliation possible. So can one say that what resulted from the conciliar document Sacrosanctum Concilium, where a lot of things are not mentioned regarding the liturgy, that the liturgy reform in a certain sense did not target the Sacrosanctum Concilium, was not faithful to the Council? And would not one have to be courageous in terms of reconciliation and take a very critical look what regards the Holy Liturgy, the core of the Church existence, the Eucharist? So what would have to be corrected or even better there? Should? Well, the actual liturgical reform went way beyond the dispositions of Sacrosanctum Concilium, and the conciliar constitution didn't ever speak of a complete disappearance of the Latin language. But this liturgy now, this liturgical reform has now been carried and authorized by the Holy Pope Paul VI and is valid and licit. And in place, as Pope Paul underlined. But if you look at the conciliar text itself, the reform went beyond that what was written. So the council of the commission that enacted the reform, it was a certain interpretation given of the principles. So first of all, one would have to recur to the basics. What is the liturgy? And Sacrosanctum Concilium number 7 says it's the acting of Christ the High Priest as head and body, acted through the ordained ministry and in the mystic body of the church, mystic body of Christ, which is the church, and the conscience of the fact that the priestly acting of the priestly action of Christ expressed in the sacramental grace, this is the heart of the liturgy. And if one thinks about that and ponders that, a lot of other thoughts, proposals, reform ideas fall into their place, into their rightly place. And in this way, we see criteria emerging according to which one can then judge what is correctly or not correctly given. We're coming to the end, but a spectator has just seen that there is just appeared on Apostolic a contribution of his contribution. Bishop Voderholzer laments a catalogue of requests against the first. And Bishop Voderholzer said, I think he didn't lament, he tried to positively refer to revelation, which is the utmost measuring rod. Maybe you would like to take the floor on that. Well, without me knowing what's in this article, the title would be totally fitting to the style with which the agency financed by the tax money of the Catholic Church, agency that tries to help up the arguments of the synodal way and denigrate the minority lege artis. And I'm part of this minority, and part of this is to blame me for things. So everybody who has been here participating knows that I've made a factual statement and tried to bring theological clearance. So I'm not lamenting, but I'm constating. I'm going in every discussion, and this is also something that the synodal way attributes to me, even by those who do not share my opinions, that I argue honestly, but we don't have only different positions, but tendentially a very unilateral and unfair media presentation even within the church, and I have to admit that this makes me angry sometimes. Thank you very much. The reaction to the official, non-official, official portal of the Catholic Church in Germany, katholisch.de, from Bavaria. A lot of faithful do not know anymore what is to be believed and what not, so we're very thankful for this transmission. So what can you recommend us to remain faithful to the Lord?
Wer immer möchte, also
whoever
fangen Sie
wants.
an, Herr Bischof.
Begin, Your Excellency.
Pray,
participate at the liturgy of the Church, there where it is celebrated well and with respect, according to the books of the Church. Read the sacred scriptures, pray the rosary, and try to deepen your relationship to Christ then you will stay on the right path. Thank you very much. I have two questions. I'll paraphrase them. Somebody from northern Germany asked, why do you explain that the Frankfurt Synodal Assembly saw only so few faithful to the traditional Catholic faith, and why does not surge more opposition against the Central Committee of Catholics? And there's another younger 17-year-old spectator from Berlin, thanking for the symposium, and asks, how does one want to bridge the distance between art, culture, and church? Before the Sixtine Chapel was painted by Michelangelo, a great artist, why isn't there anymore this close connection between art and church? Is this because one has ended or one has stopped to engage Catholic artists? Let's ask the liturgists.
Ja, es gibt natürlich auch eine Krise der Kunst.
Obviously there is a crisis of art, crisis of liberal arts, the understanding of art.
Und auf diese, es fehlt uns dann letztlich
and
auch die
we're lacking
Grundlage,
the basis, the
Kunst in der Kirche darauf aufzubauen.
We're lacking the basis to build upon. So if the general understanding of what the belles artes, what the
Papst Benedikt Joseph
liberal
Ratzinger
arts
auch dazu
provide.
geschrieben und vor allem in seinem
So,
Buch über den
if
Geist
that
der
lacks,
Liturgie,
what shall
wo
we do? Benedict
sehr schön
XVI, Joseph
ausführt, dass wir
Ratzinger
letztlich
writes in his Spirit of the
einen
Liturgy
Glauben brauchen,
that
der
we
sieht,
need
der
a
wieder
faith that
fähig
sees,
ist zu sehen.
that is
Und
able
dass
to
gerade dafür die
look out.
würdig und eben auch schön
And
gefeierte
especially for
Liturgie
this, we need the
wesentlich ist,
respectfully
tatsächlich wieder
and
ein,
beautifully celebrated
einen
liturgy.
liturgischen Raum zu
So we
schaffen,
need
der
a liturgical
Künstler
space
auch inspirieren
that
kann.
that is able to inspire artists such as Michelangelo. But well, Michelangelo in a certain regard was a bit far-going. Rather Raphael I'd mention as a better example for an artist that stood and lived in the iconographic tradition of the church and carried it on. But for this, a living, vivid
auf dieser Grundlage eben auch Schönheit darstellen.
Transmission, and we need a liturgy that is living and wants to be beautiful and inspires art. Thank you very much. All the participants here on the podium and the spectators and listeners near and far. I think even regarding all the critics expressed here, we shall not forget faith is beautiful and faith does not stay alone, to take up a word from Pope Benedict. And if we always recall that he who is the origin of the church is the church, because we are in him and live within him, and he offers us his friendship, that is Jesus Christ, and this Lord, this Son of God, is the origin of every reform of the church. So we may also recall that he said, I am the way, the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. And this is a wonderful assurance, it's a guarantee, it's a great joy, and we can understand that even if there are adversaries against the church, we have to see what's in John 8. Veritas liberabit vos, truth will set you free. And so I may ask Cardinal Koch for his final words of truth.
Lieber Herr Bischof, liebe Schwestern und Brüder,
Your Excellency, dear brothers and sisters, during the Council there was a moving inner tension in the face of the common task of letting the truth and beauty of the faith shine in the today of our time, without sacrificing it to the demands of the present, nor keeping it shackled to the past. In faith resonates the eternal presence of God, which reaches beyond time, and yet can be received by us only in our unrepeatable today. This view of the task that the Second Vatican Council faced was expressed by Pope Benedict XVI in his homily at the Holy Mass opening the Year of Faith, and which he proclaimed 50 years after the opening of the Council. These words demonstrate once again how much Pope Benedict, who as Emeritus himself took part in the Council and who was able to make many positive contributions, was thinking it an important matter that the Council be received in an authentic way throughout the Church. Departing from this, one understands that Pope Benedict did not seek the causes for the negative developments that occurred after the Council in the Council itself, but in its lacking and misguided reception. As he already stated in the 70s, I quote, "What devastated the Church of the last decade was not the Council, but the refusal to accept it." I deliberately recall this view of Benedict XVI on the task of the Second Vatican Council at the end of our symposium, because I perceive in this view a synthetic summary of what is and what is not to be understood by further development of the doctrine of the faith in our Church. So, in conclusion, let us once again hear the authentic voice of Pope Benedict XVI on the subject of our symposium. Already in his first message, on the morning after his election as Pope, he reaffirmed his firm resolve that he would continue to strive for the realization of the Second Vatican Council, that is, in the footsteps of my predecessors and in faithful continuity with the 2000-year tradition of the Church. He dedicated his first major speech at the Christmas reception for the Roman Curia in 2005 to the enduring importance of the Second Vatican Council, convinced that it can be and increasingly becomes a great force for the ever-necessary renewal of the Church, if we read and receive it with the help of the right hermeneutics. In doing so, Pope Benedict has distinguished between two opposing hermeneutics of the Council, namely, on the one hand, the hermeneutics of discontinuity and rupture, which he rejects, and on the other hand, the hermeneutics of reform, which he considers to be the adequate way of interpreting and receiving the Second Vatican Council. The hermeneutics of discontinuity and rupture see in the Council the end of the previous traditional shape of the Church, according to which something new had begun, which was tangible in the so-called spirit of the Council, but had not yet come to fruition and therefore had to be realized after the Council. This hermeneutic can be seen above all in the almost inflationary way in which a distinction is made between the so-called pre-conciliar and post-conciliar Church. The same is valid for the liturgy. In a largely dualistic view of history, the discontinuity between the time before and after the Council is emphasized. In this understanding, further development of the doctrine of the faith no longer means development, but change and reformulation after the break, after the rupture. One of the most prominent protagonists of this Council hermeneutic was Hans Küng, who wanted the Council to be understood as the integration of the paradigm of the Reformation and modernity into the Catholic Church. Since modernity essentially means a serious break with tradition, according to Küng, the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council in the modernity-compatible sense also implies an elementary break, rupture with tradition. Küng also diagnosed a serious birth defect in the Second Vatican Council, which he judged to be a council with its compromises, half measures, and ambiguities, which could only be corrected by continuing the rupture, the break, begun with the council beyond the council. The so-called traditionalists, in the spirit of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, also judged the Second Vatican Council as a serious break with tradition, claiming that with the council a new church appeared, which was no longer identical with the previous one. In contrast to the progressives, the traditionalists see the council as a rupture with tradition because they advocate a hermeneutic of pure and history-free continuity. According to this continuity, only those teachings of the council are accepted which can already be found in tradition, while those teachings of the council, such above all religious freedom, are rejected, which allegedly have no basis in tradition. According to this conciliar hermeneutic, there can be no real further development in the Church's doctrine of faith without risking and making a break, a rupture with tradition. Both of these extreme positions represent, admittedly for completely different reasons, a hermeneutic of rupture and discontinuity, because they do not understand the Second Vatican Council in the totality of the tradition of the Church. Pope Benedict XVI already recognized this misguided attitude and expressed it with the words, quote, "One cannot freeze the teaching authority of the Church in 1962. That must be quite clear to the fraternity, that is the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X. But some of those who are great defenders of the Council must also be reminded that Vatican II contains the whole doctrinal history of the Church. Those who want to be obedient to it must accept the faith of the centuries and not cut off the roots on which the tree lives." End quote. In this judgment, it becomes clear that Pope Benedict XVI considers doctrinal development possible and theologically responsible if it is really development in continuity and not change in rupture. He therefore considers the hermeneutics of discontinuity and rupture to be, quote, in the foreword of the 7th volume of its collected writing, quote, "absurd, against the spirit and against the will of the Council Fathers," end quote. In contrast to this hermeneutic, however, Pope Benedict does not represent a hermeneutic of pure continuity, as he is often accused of doing. He calls the hermeneutic of the Council, which he alone considers adequate, the hermeneutic of reform. It is characterized by the fact that with it, the faithfulness to the tradition of the Church is taken just as seriously as the dynamic that is given with the promising reforms in the Second Vatican Council. It therefore not only perceives continuity, but also reckons with discontinuities. Quote, "It is precisely in this interplay of continuity and discontinuity at different levels that the nature of true reform lies." Unquote. With this principle of a renewal of the Church and also of its teaching in continuity with tradition, it becomes visible how Pope Benedict XVI understands the Second Vatican Council as a whole. According to his own intention, the Second Vatican Council, like every previous council, wanted to be understood and interpreted in the light of the comprehensive and living tradition of the Church. This continuity with tradition, however, has been perceived by the Council in an innovative way, by combining the tradition of the Church with an envisioning interpretation in the new historical situation in which the Church lives. The Council has been open to tradition, and at the same time it has been open to the present and the future of the faith. In the process of developing the new while preserving continuity, the Council was concerned with the renewal of the one subject Church. I quote, "The Church is a subject that grows and develops with time, but always remains itself, the people of God as the one subject on its way." In this twofold sense, the Second Vatican Council was a reform council. It did not create a new church in a rupture with tradition, nor did it intend a new faith, but a renewed church and a renewal of faith out of the spirit of the Christian message, which has been revealed once and for all and handed down in the living tradition of the Church. True renewal, therefore, consists in a return to the original, which is to be regarded as normative. The Council Fathers were convinced of the necessity of such a renewal, and they renewed the Church from the sources of faith in sacred scripture and in the fathers of the Church, so that it could fulfill its mission in the challenges of the times and thus in keeping with the times. For the Council, faithfulness to one's origins and conformity to the times, not opposites, are not opposites as they have widely become after the Council and as they continue to have an effect on today's polarizations within the Church. The Council, however, wanted to proclaim the Catholic faith true to its origins and in keeping with the times, in order to be able to pass on the truth and beauty of the faith to the people today in such a way that they can understand it and accept it as a gift for their lives. What is to be said of the reform of the Church also applies to the renewal and further development of the teaching of the faith. It must be oriented towards the binding revelation and interpreted anew in the respective time in such a way that it can be received and understood by people. In the sense of a synthesis, I will conclude by giving the floor to Professor Ralph Weimann, who dedicated his comprehensive doctoral dissertation, Dogma and Progress in Joseph Ratzinger, to this important topic. I quote, "The Church has the task of communicating truth through the ages, for it is that living trans-temporal subject in which Christ is present, who transcends the ages. Neither the static of identity nor the progress of becoming can provide orientation, but a rightly understood continuity can, which makes possible a progress in knowledge to the extent that it preserves fidelity to its origin. In this way, development can be understood as an expression of the vitality of that which remains the same, and thus one can speak of a fundamental invariance of the thing and a variance of its mental and linguistic version." Unquote. I hope that today's symposium on the important topic of binding truth and further development of the Church's teaching can provide orientation in today's difficult situation of the Church and its faith. I would like to thank all those who helped to prepare and conduct the symposium, especially the speakers for their contributions and Mr. Martin Lohman for his competent moderation, the leader of the Schuelerkreis, Dr. Joseph Ratzinger, and the board of the new Schuelerkreis, Professor Christoph Ohly, Father Dr. Sven Konrad, and Reverend Dr. Rainer Hangler. I would like to say a special thank you to all the participants in the symposium here in the hall and on Radio Horeb and EWTN television, and I thank especially the translators of lectures and discussion. Let us continue on our way, strengthened in the spirit of St. Paul. Let us be grateful for what we have been allowed to receive as a revelation from God, and let us generously and joyfully pass on what we have received, the truth and beauty of our faith, which is always the same, but wants to be lived today, so that it can also be a lived faith in today's lesson of history, in the conviction that Jesus Christ is the true newness that no other newness can ever catch up with. So we can really convey this, we have to move this in our hearts, ponder it in our hearts as Mary did. And so I invite you that we turn to Mary and speak a prayer for conclusion.
Der Engel des Herrn brachte Maria die Botschaft. Gegrüßt seist du, Maria, voll der Gnade, der Herr ist mit dir. Du bist gebenedeit unter den Frauen, und gebenedeit ist die Frucht deines Leibes, Jesus. Maria sprach, ich bin die Magd des Herrn.
Mir geschehe nach deinem Wort.
Gegrüßt seist du, Maria, voll der Gnade, der Herr ist mit dir. Du bist gebenedeit unter den Frauen, und gebenedeit ist die Frucht deines Leibes, Jesus.
Heilige Maria, Mutter Gottes, bitte für uns Sünder, jetzt und in der Stunde unseres Todes. Amen.
Und das Wort ist Fleisch geworden
und hat unter uns gewohnt.
Gegrüßt seist du, Maria, voll der Gnade, der Herr ist mit dir. Du bist gebenedeit unter den Frauen, und gebenedeit ist die Frucht deines Leibes, Jesus.
Heilige Maria, Mutter Gottes, bitte für uns Sünder, jetzt und in der Stunde unseres Todes. Amen.
Bitte für uns, heilige Gottesmutter,
dass wir würdig werden der Verheißung Christi.
Lasset uns beten. Allmächtiger Gott, gieße deine Gnade in unsere Herzen ein. Durch die Botschaft des Engels haben wir die Menschwerdung Christi, deines Sohnes, erkannt. Führe uns durch sein Leiden und Kreuz zur Herrlichkeit der Auferstehung durch Christus, unseren Herrn.
Amen.
Ehre sei dem Vater und dem Sohn und dem Heiligen Geist.
Wie im Anfang, so auch jetzt, alle Zeit und in Ewigkeit. Amen.
Der Herr sei mit euch.
Und mit deinem Geiste.
Der Name des Herrn sei gepriesen.
Von nun an bis in Ewigkeit.
Unsere Hilfe ist im Namen des Herrn,
der Himmel und Erde erschaffen hat.
Auf die Fürsprache der Gottesmutter Maria und der heiligen Rupert und Virgil segne und behüte euch der lebendige, gütige und dreieine Gott, der Vater, der Sohn und der Heilige Geist.
Amen.
Wir wünschen Ihnen einen guten Abend und eine frohe Heimkehr und eine weiteres Freude am Glauben.